Nicole Thomas had barely survived childbirth when her husband Charles Bennett walked into her hospital room carrying separation papers instead of flowers. In front of nurses' visitors and a young mother recovering across the room, he calmly declared that he refused to spend his future tied to someone he believed had become a burden. Nicole said nothing. She simply cradled her newborn while signing only the acknowledgement of receipt. Charles mistook her silence for defeat. He never imagined that only hours earlier, a sealed legal file had named Nicole the sole heir to a multi-billion-dollar fortune, and that every word he spoke that morning would soon become evidence no courtroom could ignore. If you believe dignity is revealed, not by how loudly someone speaks, but by how they choose to act when they are treated unfairly, let us know where you're watching from and your local time in the comments. And if stories of quiet strength, truth, and justice resonate with you, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next journey. Before motherhood changed everything, Nicole Thomas had been the kind of woman people rarely noticed until they needed someone dependable. She was not the loudest person in a room, nor the one eager to collect praise. She listened more than she spoke, observed more than she reacted, and developed the quiet habit of remembering details others dismissed. A date written on the corner of a receipt, a sentence repeated during an argument, a promise made casually over dinner. She kept notebooks, not diaries filled with emotions, but organized pages, recording appointments, expenses, family milestones, and conversations that seemed important. It was a habit her mother had once called unnecessary. Years later, it would become one of the strongest foundations beneath her life. Nicole believed memories could be questioned. Records rarely could. She had met Charles Bennett almost 8 years earlier during a charity fundraiser in Chicago. At the time, Charles was an ambitious financial analyst trying to establish himself inside a respected investment firm. His tailored suit had been borrowed from his older brother. His confidence, however, belonged entirely to him. He spoke about building companies instead of merely working for them. He dreamed of boardrooms acquisitions and seeing his name printed beside successful business headlines. Nicole admired ambition when it was paired with discipline, and Charles seemed to possess both. During those first years together, their relationship felt balanced. Charles chased opportunity. Nicole quietly built stability. When Charles accepted longer hours, Nicole adjusted her own schedule without complaint. When he decided to pursue an executive MBA at night, she managed their apartment, cooked late dinners, and proofread countless presentations after midnight. She had graduated with honors in business administration herself, yet she postponed several promising career opportunities because the couple agreed that Charles's promotion offered the stronger financial future. It had never felt like sacrifice to her. Marriage, she believed, was measured in seasons. Sometimes one person carried more weight, so the other could climb. Later, those roles would reverse, or at least she believed they would. As Charles advanced through corporate leadership, something subtle began changing. It wasn't sudden enough for friends to notice. It happened one small decision at a time. Business dinners replaced anniversaries. Conference calls interrupted weekends. Vacations became networking events. Compliments became observations. Observations became criticisms. Nicole noticed them all. She simply chose not to answer everyone. When Charles received his first executive promotion, they celebrated with inexpensive takeout because he insisted saving money mattered more than appearances. 3 years later, appearances seemed to matter more than almost everything else. Their home gradually filled with designer furniture Charles insisted clients expected successful executives to own. Luxury watches appeared, imported suits, private clubs, membership fees. None of those purchases truly worried Nicole. What unsettled her was how often Charles began evaluating people according to what they owned. He complimented promotions more often than kindness. He admired expensive neighborhoods more than happy families. Without realizing it, success had quietly become his favorite language. Nicole saw the transformation long before anyone else. She hoped it was temporary. Then, she discovered she was pregnant. The news arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. Charles smiled. He hugged her. He even cried. For several weeks, Nicole believed the baby might restore the balance they had gradually lost. Instead, reality unfolded differently. The pregnancy became physically difficult far earlier than expected. Persistent nausea lasted months. Her blood pressure climbed. Doctors ordered additional monitoring. Eventually, they recommended reducing physical activity almost completely. Nicole accepted every medical instruction without complaint. Charles accepted them with visible frustration. He never questioned the doctors directly. Instead, he questioned inconvenience. Another appointment. Another canceled dinner. Another weekend spent at home. Another business trip postponed because Nicole was advised not to remain alone. "I know this isn't your fault," he would sometimes say. Then he would sigh heavily enough to make the sentence feel incomplete. Nicole noticed that too. As the months passed, Charles spent increasing amounts of time inside the office. Even when he returned home, his attention remained fixed on emails glowing across his phone. Conversations became shorter. Silences became longer. One evening, Nicole quietly placed dinner on the table nearly an hour after Charles arrived home. He barely looked up. "Can we make this quick?" he asked while typing. "I have an investor call." Nicole nodded. She waited until he finished before eating. That dinner lasted less than 12 minutes. She wrote nothing about it in her notebook. Some disappointments required no documentation. Meanwhile, across the country in Boston, 84-year-old Richard Whitmore sat alone inside the library of Whitmore Estate. Few Americans recognized his face. Millions recognized the companies he owned. Over 5 decades, Richard had quietly built Whitmore Capital Holdings into one of the largest privately controlled investment organizations in the United States. Its portfolio stretched across commercial real estate, renewable energy, logistics, healthcare technology, manufacturing, and banking partnerships. Financial magazines described him as disciplined. Competitors described him as relentless. Employees described him as fair. Very few people knew the deepest regret of his life had nothing to do with business. Nicole. More accurately, losing Nicole. Years earlier, family disagreements had fractured Richard's relationship with Nicole's parents. Pride hardened into silence. Silence stretched into decades. By the time Richard realized how meaningless the conflict had become, distance had already done what anger could not. Nicole grew up believing her grandfather wanted nothing to do with her. Richard knew the opposite was true. Every birthday, he quietly requested updates through private investigators, whose instructions never crossed legal boundaries. He never interfered. He simply wanted reassurance that she was healthy. When Nicole graduated from college, Richard saw the commencement photograph before she did. When she married Charles Bennett, Richard read every publicly available article about the ceremony. When Nicole purchased her modest suburban home, Richard smiled because he noticed the mortgage had been carefully calculated rather than stretched beyond reason. He admired that. She reminded him of the person he had once been before wealth complicated everything. His attorneys often encouraged reconciliation. Richard always answered the same way. Not until she can choose freely. He refused to use money to reopen relationships. If Nicole ever came back into his life, he wanted it to be because she wished to, not because billions stood behind his name. Now his health was failing. Heart complications had become frequent. Hospital visits increased. Specialists offered careful optimism, but Richard understood time differently than doctors did. He began reviewing his estate. Every document, every trust, every corporate succession plan. Leading those meetings was Margaret Collins, the attorney who had represented Richard for nearly 30 years. Professional, patient, exceptionally precise. She knew every clause inside the Whitmore family estate. One afternoon, after reviewing several revisions, Margaret asked quietly, "Are you absolutely certain?" Richard looked through the tall windows, overlooking the frozen gardens. "I've never been more certain of anything." He signed another document. Nicole Thomas remained the primary beneficiary. Not because she had earned billions, not because she expected them, but because Richard believed character should inherit responsibility. Across the country, Nicole knew none of this. She was 38 weeks pregnant. She was assembling a crib inside a small nursery painted soft sage green. She folded tiny blankets, labeled baby bottles, checked hospital bags one final time. Charles glanced inside the room as he tightened his tie before leaving for work. "It looks nice," he said. Nicole smiled warmly. "I hope our baby likes it." Charles looked at his watch. "I'm running late." He kissed the top of her head almost absent-mindedly before walking out the front door. Nicole stood quietly in the nursery after he left. The house felt unusually still. Outside, early autumn leaves drifted across the driveway. Inside, she rested one hand gently against her stomach as the baby moved beneath her heartbeat. She had no idea that hundreds of miles away, an elderly man she barely remembered was making decisions that would soon alter every chapter of her future. Nor could she imagine that before she ever learned his final gift, the man she trusted most would make a decision that would change theirs forever. The call to the hospital came just before dawn. Nicole Thomas had awakened with a dull ache across her lower back, assuming it was another sleepless night brought on by the final weeks of pregnancy. She carefully sat on the edge of the bed, breathing slowly as another wave of discomfort tightened around her abdomen. Within minutes, the ache settled into a steady rhythm. She checked the clock. 4:17 a.m. Charles Bennett barely stirred as she gently touched his shoulder. "I think it's time." He opened his eyes, looked toward the clock, and immediately reached for his phone before saying anything else. 2 missed emails from overseas clients had arrived overnight. Only after reading the notifications did he look at Nicole. "You sure?" She nodded quietly. Another contraction answered for her. The drive to Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago took less than 30 minutes. Rain had begun falling before sunrise, leaving the streets almost empty. Nicole stared through the passenger window, counting each contraction exactly as her doctor had instructed. Charles drove with one hand on the steering wheel and the other occasionally checking messages at red lights. Nicole noticed. She said nothing. By the time they reached the maternity entrance, the contractions had intensified enough that walking required assistance from one of the nurses waiting with a wheelchair. Inside the labor and delivery unit, everything moved quickly. Identification bracelets, medical history, blood pressure, fetal monitoring, consent forms. Nicole answered each question calmly, despite increasing pain. Charles signed where instructed, though his attention repeatedly drifted back toward the glowing screen of his phone. Their attending obstetrician doctor, Melissa Harper, reviewed Nicole's chart carefully. "The baby's heartbeat looks good," she said with a reassuring smile. "But your blood pressure is higher than we'd like. We'll monitor you closely." Nicole smiled weakly. Whatever keeps the baby safe. The next 12 hours became longer than either of them had expected. Labor progressed slowly. Medication helped only briefly. Doctors grew increasingly concerned as Nicole's blood pressure continued climbing. Nurses entered and exited the room, almost constantly adjusting monitors and speaking quietly among themselves. Charles remained present physically. Emotionally, he seemed somewhere else. Around noon, his phone vibrated again. He stepped into the hallway. Nicole watched the partially closed door as his voice drifted through the opening. "No, I won't make the meeting." A pause. "I said postpone it." Another pause. "I understand what the board expects." His tone sharpened. "No, this isn't something I can leave." Nicole closed her eyes. For a brief moment, she felt grateful. Maybe he truly wanted to stay. Maybe she had misjudged the distance growing between them. When Charles returned, he forced a tired smile. "Everything okay?" she asked. He nodded. "Work." She didn't ask anything else. Late that afternoon, complications developed. The baby's heart rate briefly dropped during several contractions. Dr. Harper immediately ordered additional monitoring. Within minutes, more physicians entered the room. Instructions became shorter. Movements became faster. Nicole remained remarkably calm, despite the urgency surrounding her. Charles, however, began pacing. "What's happening?" he demanded. "We're taking precautions," Dr. Harper answered evenly. "Right now, our priority is delivering a healthy baby while protecting your wife's health." Hours later, after an exhausting labor that seemed endless, their son finally entered the world. His first cry filled the room with unmistakable life. Nicole's exhausted face softened into tears. The nurse carefully placed the newborn against her chest. Tiny fingers curled instinctively around the edge of the hospital blanket. For several silent seconds, nothing else existed. Not the monitors, not the doctors, not the fatigue, only mother and child. Charles stepped closer. He looked at his son, smiled, took several photographs. Then his phone rang again. He hesitated, apologized quietly, walked into the hallway to answer it. Nicole watched the door close behind him. She lowered her eyes toward the sleeping infant resting against her heartbeat. The room suddenly felt much quieter. Unfortunately, the delivery was not the end of Nicole's medical challenges. Excessive blood loss left her dangerously weak. Her blood pressure remained unstable. Dr. Harper recommended keeping Nicole hospitalized several additional days for observation. Charles frowned slightly. "Several days?" "I'm afraid so," the doctor replied. "She needs careful monitoring before discharge." He nodded politely, but disappointment crossed his face before he could hide it. Nicole noticed. Again, she remained silent. The following morning, Charles arrived later than expected. Instead of flowers, he carried a laptop. Instead of breakfast, he carried conference schedules. He kissed Nicole briefly, asked how she was feeling, then spent nearly 2 hours working from a chair beside her hospital bed. The baby slept peacefully. Nicole quietly watched sunlight move across the window. She found herself studying Charles instead. Not criticizing, simply observing. Every time his phone vibrated, he answered immediately. Every time one of the nurses entered, he minimized spreadsheets on his computer. Every time Nicole asked a simple question, his answers became shorter. "I'm fine. Everything's handled. We'll talk later." On the third day, one of the nurses accidentally entered while Charles was speaking on speakerphone. He quickly lowered his voice. "I can't keep delaying this." The nurse froze briefly before apologizing and stepping back into the hallway. Nicole looked toward Charles. He smiled awkwardly. "Just work." She nodded, but she remembered the sentence. That evening, after Charles left, the same nurse quietly checked Nicole's medication. "I'm sorry," the nurse said gently. "You seem very patient." Nicole smiled faintly. "My mother used to say people reveal themselves when they think no one's paying attention." The nurse hesitated before answering. "I think your mother was wise." Nothing more was said. Meanwhile, downtown Charles entered an office building that remained brightly lit despite the late hour. The name on the frosted glass door read, Daniel Foster, family law attorney. Daniel had spent nearly 25 years handling high-net-worth divorces and complex marital separations. He greeted Charles professionally. "You wanted to move quickly." Charles nodded. "I don't think this marriage is working anymore." Daniel opened a legal pad. "When did you reach that conclusion?" Charles leaned back. "If I'm honest." He paused. "Months ago." "What changed?" Charles looked toward the window. "The pregnancy changed everything." Daniel remained expressionless. "In what way?" "My entire life started revolving around appointments, restrictions, hospitals, complications." He rubbed his forehead. "I worked too hard to spend the next 20 years taking care of someone who's always going to need something." Daniel wrote carefully without commenting. Then he asked the question every attorney needed answered. "Has your wife done anything that would legally justify fault?" "No." "Infidelity?" "No." "Financial misconduct?" "No." "Abuse?" "Absolutely not." Daniel closed the file briefly. "So your decision is entirely personal?" Charles answered without hesitation. "Yes." Daniel explained the separation process carefully. Documentation, financial disclosures, property inventories, notification procedures. Charles listened closely. He wanted everything prepared before Nicole returned home. "I'd rather end this cleanly," he said. Daniel simply nodded. Professional experience had taught him never to confuse confidence with wisdom. The next morning, Charles quietly began collecting copies of tax returns, mortgage records, investment statements, and bank documents from the home office. He scanned everything electronically, created organized folders, changed passwords on several financial accounts he managed personally. Automatic banking alerts reached Nicole's email. She noticed unfamiliar login notifications while feeding the baby. Perhaps Charles was organizing paperwork for insurance claims, she thought. She chose not to question him. Across the country, another legal office was beginning its own preparations. Inside Whitmore Capital's headquarters in Boston, Margaret Collins stood beside a long conference table covered with confidential estate documents. Richard Whitmore had passed away peacefully during the night. Only a small circle of executives knew. His death certificate had been signed less than 2 hours earlier. His final instructions were already being activated. Margaret opened the sealed succession binder. The first page confirmed exactly what Richard had intended. Primary heir, Nicole Thomas. No competing claims, no amendments, no uncertainty. Margaret quietly looked toward her assistant. "We need to find Miss Thomas immediately." "Do we know where she is?" Margaret glanced at the latest investigator's report. "Yes." A brief silence followed. "She's recovering in a hospital after giving birth." Margaret slowly closed the folder. "So while one family is beginning..." She looked once more at Richard's signature. "Another has already lost someone." Hundreds of miles away, Nicole held her sleeping son close, completely unaware that 2 entirely separate legal processes had already begun moving toward her. One promised unimaginable responsibility. The other threatened to dismantle the family she still hoped could be saved. Neither would wait much longer. The 4th morning after Nicole Thomas gave birth began with unusual silence. The overnight nurses had already finished their shift, and soft sunlight filtered through the tall hospital windows, casting long bands of gold across the polished floor. The maternity wing was calmer than it had been in days. Most newborns had settled after the early feeding, and the only sounds drifting through the hallway were the quiet wheels of medication carts and the occasional cry of an infant searching for comfort. Nicole had been awake since before sunrise. Sleep came in short fragments now. Between feeding her son, checking his breathing, and recovering from the difficult delivery, she rarely rested for more than an hour at a time. Her body still ached. The surgical stitches pulled every time she shifted in bed. Her arms trembled slightly whenever she lifted the baby for too long. Yet the moment she looked into her son's peaceful face, the discomfort seemed smaller. She reached for the small notebook resting inside the drawer beside her bed. It was the same notebook she had carried throughout her pregnancy. Most of its pages contained doctor's appointments, medication schedules, grocery lists, and reminders. On a fresh page, she quietly wrote, Day 4, baby fed at 6:10 a.m., temperature normal. Doctor expected around 9:00. She paused, then added another sentence. Charles has seemed distant since before the delivery. Observe, don't assume. She closed the notebook. The words were not written from bitterness, only caution. Nearly 40 minutes later, a gentle knock sounded against the partially open door. Nurse Angela Morris entered carrying fresh linens. Good morning, she whispered, careful not to wake the baby. Nicole smiled. Good morning. How are you feeling today? A little stronger. Angela checked Nicole's blood pressure. Better than yesterday. I'm hoping Dr. Harper lets us go home soon. Angela hesitated for just a moment. I know you're eager. She smiled warmly. But don't rush healing. Nicole nodded. I won't. As Angela adjusted the baby's blanket, she glanced toward the empty chair beside the bed. Will your husband be coming this morning? He said he had something important to do first. Angela simply nodded. Professional experience had taught her never to comment on family dynamics unless absolutely necessary. She quietly left the room. Nearly an hour later, footsteps echoed through the hallway. Nicole expected Charles to enter carrying coffee, perhaps flowers, maybe breakfast. Instead, Charles Bennett stepped inside, holding a slim black leather briefcase. He wore a navy business suit instead of casual clothes. His tie was perfectly centered. His shoes had clearly been polished that morning. He looked less like a husband visiting his recovering wife than an executive arriving for an important meeting. Nicole noticed immediately. So early? She asked gently. I have meetings later. His voice sounded flat. I wanted to stop here first. She smiled faintly. I'm glad you came. Charles placed the briefcase on the small visitor's table but did not sit down. For several seconds, he simply looked around the room. The baby slept peacefully. Machines beeped quietly. Morning sunlight continued creeping across the floor. Nicole sensed something was wrong. Not because of what Charles said, because of what he carefully avoided saying. Is everything all right? She asked. Charles inhaled slowly. I think we need to have a conversation. Nicole looked down at her sleeping son before meeting Charles's eyes again. I'm listening. Instead of answering immediately, Charles opened the briefcase. He removed a thick manila folder. Nicole recognized legal formatting before she could read a single word. Every page carried official letterhead. Every document had colored tabs attached along the side. Charles placed the folder gently on the hospital tray in front of her. I've already spoken with an attorney. Nicole stared at the folder. She did not touch it. Charles continued speaking. I've decided we should separate. The room remained completely still. A newborn stirred softly inside the bassinet. Somewhere beyond the hallway, an elevator bell chimed. Nicole blinked once. Nothing more. Charles seemed almost uncomfortable with how little emotion appeared on her face. I don't think this marriage works anymore. Still, she said nothing. He interpreted the silence as hesitation. I've spent months thinking about this. Nicole finally asked one quiet question. For months? Yes. So before our son was born? Charles looked away briefly. Yes. Those 3 letters carried more weight than any speech could have. Nicole lowered her eyes toward the folder. She still had not opened it. Outside the room, 2 nurses slowed as they passed. The door had remained slightly open after Charles entered. Neither nurse intended to eavesdrop, but raised voices were rare inside the maternity wing. One quietly exchanged a glance with the other before continuing their rounds. Inside, Charles kept talking. I don't want a long legal battle. I think ending things now is better for everyone. Nicole listened without interrupting. You'll have time to recover. I'll provide reasonable support. But I don't see a future together anymore. Nicole finally looked at him. What changed? Charles hesitated, then answered with startling honesty. Our lives. You've needed more and more. The pregnancy. He searched for words. The complications. The hospital. I don't want my entire future revolving around medical problems. Nicole absorbed every sentence without visible reaction. You believe I've become a burden. Charles exhaled. I didn't say it exactly that way. You didn't have to. Another silence settled between them. At that moment, Dr. Melissa Harper approached the doorway carrying Nicole's updated chart. She immediately sensed the atmosphere inside. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I can come back. Charles shook his head. It'll only take another minute. Dr. Harper noticed the legal documents lying on the hospital tray. She looked briefly at Nicole. Nicole gave the slightest nod. The physician understood. Without another word, she stepped back into the hallway, gently closing the door halfway to provide privacy. Unfortunately, privacy was now impossible. Across the corridor, another young mother sat feeding her newborn beside the window. She could not hear every word. She could hear enough. Charles slid a pen across the tray. I'd appreciate it if you'd acknowledge receiving these today. Nicole finally reached for the folder. She opened it carefully. Every page was neatly organized. Petition for legal separation, temporary financial arrangements, property disclosures, instructions regarding future communication through attorneys. She read every page, slowly, precisely. Charles shifted his weight impatiently. You don't have to read everything now. I do. Her answer was calm. I sign nothing until I've read it. 20 minutes passed. Charles checked his watch several times. Nicole eventually reached the final page. She picked up the pen. Instead of signing the separation agreement itself, she signed only the acknowledgement confirming she had received the documents. She quietly pushed the folder back toward Charles. I've acknowledged receipt. I haven't agreed to anything. Charles frowned slightly. My attorney said you'd probably want time. I do. She folded her hands across the hospital blanket. I'll have counsel review everything. The statement surprised him. Counsel? Yes. I'll retain legal representation. Charles forced a polite smile. That's your choice. Nicole nodded. It is. He closed the folder and returned it to his briefcase. Neither of them noticed Nurse Angela standing several feet down the hallway, recording the routine visitor log required for every maternity room. She wrote, Visitor arrived 9:18 a.m. Visitor departed 9:46 a.m. Hospital policy required precise times. Nothing more, nothing less. Those ordinary records would later become unexpectedly important. Before leaving, Charles looked once toward the sleeping baby. I'll arrange visitation, Nicole answered softly. He'll always know who his father is. Charles paused, perhaps expecting anger, perhaps hoping for tears. Neither came. Instead, Nicole asked one final question. Was today the first day you spoke to your attorney? Charles hesitated only briefly. No. When? A few weeks ago. Nicole gave a small nod. I understand. She did, more than Charles realized. He walked toward the door without another word. The briefcase remained tucked beneath his arm. The separation papers had been delivered. The decision in his mind was finished. After the door closed behind him, Nicole remained perfectly still. She neither cried nor shouted. She simply reached for the notebook inside the bedside drawer. On a clean page, she carefully wrote, September 18th, 9 to 18 a.m. Charles arrived, presented legal separation documents. Confirmed decision had been made before our son's birth. Signed only acknowledgement of receipt. She underlined the final sentence once, then closed the notebook. Outside the hospital, Charles drove away, believing silence meant surrender. He never imagined that Nicole's quiet nature was not weakness. It was discipline. Nor did he realize that somewhere in Boston, another team of attorneys was already searching for the hospital where she lay recovering. By the time those two legal paths finally crossed, every document signed that morning, including the visitor log, the hospital records, and Charles's own admissions, would become pieces of a much larger story that no one could stop. Nicole Thomas was discharged from the hospital 2 days after Charles Bennett served her the separation papers. The morning she left, the maternity ward looked almost cheerful. Fresh flowers stood beside several beds. Families posed for photographs in front of the nursery window. New fathers struggled awkwardly with infant car seats while nurses patiently corrected loose straps and twisted blankets. Life moved forward with quiet optimism. Nicole smiled politely whenever someone congratulated her. She thanked every nurse who had cared for her. She hugged Dr. Melissa Harper before leaving. You've been stronger than you realize, Dr. Harper told her. Nicole looked down at her sleeping son. I didn't have much choice. Dr. Harper smiled gently. Sometimes that's exactly where strength begins. Nicole nodded. She would remember those words much later. Outside the hospital entrance, early October air carried the first hint of approaching winter. Instead of returning to the suburban house she had shared with Charles, Nicole climbed into the passenger seat of a small silver SUV driven by her closest friend, Olivia Brooks. They had known each other since college. Unlike many friendships that slowly faded after graduation, theirs had endured through career changes, marriages, and long periods of busy silence. Olivia was practical, warm, and remarkably loyal. She never offered dramatic advice. She preferred solving problems. As she carefully secured the infant carrier in the back seat, she looked toward Nicole. Ready? Nicole glanced once at the hospital doors before answering. I think so. Neither woman mentioned Charles. There seemed little reason to. The drive across Chicago remained mostly quiet. Nicole watched rows of autumn trees blur past the window while her son slept peacefully behind them. Only once did Olivia speak. You don't have to tell me anything until you're ready, Nicole smiled faintly. I know. And if you never want to talk about him? Olivia shrugged gently. That's okay too. Nicole looked outside again. I'll need to. Eventually. But not today. Olivia nodded. Then today we'll just get you home. The apartment waiting for Nicole belonged to Olivia's older sister, who had recently accepted a temporary teaching position overseas. It was modest. 1 bedroom, small kitchen, large windows overlooking a quiet residential street. No luxury, no unnecessary decoration. Exactly what Nicole needed. As Olivia carried grocery bags upstairs, Nicole slowly entered the apartment holding her son. For the first time since giving birth, there were no hospital monitors, no visitors, no lawyers, no footsteps echoing through hallways, only silence. She placed the baby carefully inside the portable bassinet Olivia had already assembled beside the bed. For several minutes, she simply stood there. The room felt unfamiliar, yet strangely peaceful. Olivia returned carrying another box. I picked up diapers formula just in case, frozen meals, and enough coffee to survive a small disaster. Nicole laughed softly for the first time in days. Thank you. You don't thank family. Olivia placed a hand gently on Nicole's shoulder. You let family help. That afternoon, while the baby slept, Nicole began unpacking. She worked slowly, not because there were many belongings, because every movement still reminded her of childbirth. She unpacked baby clothes first, then bottles, then blankets. Finally, she opened the canvas tote bag she had brought from the hospital. Inside rested the items she considered most important: medical discharge papers, prescription instructions, insurance documents, her notebook, and the manila folder Charles had left on the hospital tray. She placed everything neatly across the dining table. Olivia noticed. You really are going through paperwork already. Nicole nodded. I need everything organized. You should be resting. I will. She smiled gently. But I'll rest better once I know where everything is. That answer sounded exactly like the Nicole Olivia had always known. Methodical, quiet, never overwhelmed for long. Nicole separated the documents into labeled folders: hospital records, baby records, financial documents, legal correspondence. She highlighted important dates using small colored tabs. Then she opened her notebook and created another page. Timeline: hospital admission, delivery, complications, date Charles med attorney estimated, date separation documents delivered, hospital discharge, temporary residence. She left several blank spaces beneath each entry. There would almost certainly be more to add. Olivia watched silently. Finally, she asked, Do you think you'll fight him? Nicole looked up. I'm not fighting anyone. But you're hiring a lawyer. Yes. Isn't that the same thing? Nicole slowly shook her head. No. She carefully placed another document into its folder. I'm protecting the truth. There is a difference. Late that evening, after Olivia had gone home, Nicole fed her son beside the apartment window. Streetlights reflected softly across the pavement below. The neighborhood was quiet. For a few precious minutes, life felt almost ordinary. Then her phone rang. Unknown number, Boston area code. Nicole frowned. She almost ignored it. Instead, she answered, Hello? A calm, professional voice responded. Good evening. May I speak with Miss Nicole Thomas? This is Nicole. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm an attorney calling on behalf of the estate of Richard Whitmore. Nicole searched her memory. The name felt distant, almost unfamiliar. I'm sorry, she replied politely. I think you may have the wrong person. I don't believe we do. Margaret's tone remained composed. Richard Whitmore was your maternal grandfather. Nicole's expression changed. My grandfather passed away years ago. No, Margaret answered gently. I believe you're referring to your other grandfather. Nicole remained silent. The only Richard Whitmore she vaguely remembered was someone her mother never discussed. A man who had disappeared from family conversations before Nicole was old enough to ask questions. I don't understand. I realize this call is unexpected. It is. There are confidential matters regarding Mr. Whitmore's estate that require your immediate attention. Nicole's first instinct was suspicion. "I'm sorry, but there are many scams involving inheritances." "I completely understand." Margaret almost seemed to expect the response. "I would be equally cautious." She continued, "I'm not asking for financial information. I'm asking whether you would be willing to verify my identity." "How?" "I'll provide the direct number listed on Whitmore Capital Holdings' public website. You may independently locate that website yourself. You may also contact the probate court handling Mr. Whitmore's estate. And if you prefer, you may bring your own attorney to any meeting." Nicole listened carefully. Nothing about the conversation sounded manipulative. Nothing sounded rushed. Everything encouraged independent verification. That made it even stranger. Margaret spoke again. "I understand you've recently given birth." Nicole stiffened slightly. "How do you know that?" "Our investigators confirmed your identity before contacting you. They were instructed only to verify your location after Mr. Whitmore's passing." Nicole remained cautious. "You've been investigating me." "No," Margaret corrected gently. "We've been trying to locate the beneficiary named in Mr. Whitmore's estate." The word lingered in the room. Beneficiary. Nicole looked toward her sleeping son. "There must be some mistake." "I don't believe there is. I'd like to meet you." Margaret paused respectfully. "Whenever your health permits." After ending the call, Nicole immediately searched for Whitmore Capital Holdings online. The company existed. Its website appeared legitimate. Richard Whitmore appeared in photographs from financial magazines stretching back decades. She searched probate records. His obituary had been published only the previous day. She stared at the screen for a long time. Nothing made sense. The following afternoon, she met with Jonathan Pierce, a local attorney recommended by Olivia's law firm. Jonathan specialized in estate review and civil litigation. After carefully listening to Nicole describe the phone call, he leaned back thoughtfully. "It could still be fraudulent." Nicole nodded. "I know. But if it isn't?" He folded his hands. "Then ignoring it would be equally dangerous." "What would you do?" "I'd verify everything independently. Then attend the meeting." "You won't sign anything. You won't agree to anything. You'll simply listen." Nicole appreciated the advice. It sounded exactly like something she would have chosen herself. 3 days later, Margaret Collins arrived in Chicago. Rather than requesting Nicole visit an expensive corporate office, she reserved a private conference room inside a respected downtown law firm. When Nicole entered, carrying her notebook and accompanied by Jonathan Pierce, Margaret stood immediately. She extended her hand. "I'm very sorry for your loss." Nicole answered honestly, "I didn't know him." Margaret's eyes reflected genuine sadness. "I know. And I believe that fact troubled Richard Whitmore more than anyone ever realized." She carefully placed a thick leather portfolio on the conference table, then slid it gently toward Nicole. Inside were certified probate documents, trust agreements, family records, photographs, and finally one sealed envelope. Across the front, written in careful handwriting, were only 4 words. "For Nicole Thomas." Margaret waited until Nicole looked up, then spoke quietly. "Before we discuss the estate." She took a slow breath. "There is something your grandfather wanted you to hear in his own words." Nicole rested one trembling hand on the unopened envelope. For reasons she could not explain, opening that single letter suddenly felt far more frightening than reading any legal document Charles had ever placed before her. Nicole Thomas looked at the sealed envelope for several long seconds before touching it. The conference room had fallen completely silent. Margaret Collins sat across the polished oak table with her hands folded neatly in front of her. Jonathan Pierce remained beside Nicole, without saying a word. Neither attorney wanted to interrupt a moment that was no longer about contracts or probate law. It was about family, about decades that could never be lived again. Nicole carefully broke the wax seal. Inside rested 3 handwritten pages. The paper was thick, the handwriting firm, despite the slight tremor visible in several lines. She began reading. Nicole, if this letter has reached you, then I have already left this world. I wish I had found the courage to write years earlier. You have every reason not to forgive me. Nicole stopped. Her eyes lingered on the final sentence. There was no attempt to excuse the past, no effort to justify old decisions, only acceptance. She continued reading. Richard Whitmore explained that the conflict separating the family had begun with business disagreements that slowly became personal pride. Every year, he intended to reach out. Every year, he waited for what he believed would be a better moment. Eventually, too much time had passed. He admitted following Nicole's life from a respectful distance, not interfering, not attempting to influence her choices, only making certain she was safe. He wrote about her college graduation, her wedding, the purchase of her first home, the newspaper announcement of her pregnancy. I watched every milestone, he wrote, because regret is a poor substitute for presence. Nicole quietly wiped away a tear. Jonathan looked toward the window to give her privacy. Margaret lowered her eyes. The final page was shorter. Wealth cannot repair lost years. It cannot replace birthdays I missed or conversations we never shared. But responsibility can still be placed into worthy hands. I have spent my life evaluating character. From everything I learned about you, you never measured people by what they owned. That is precisely why you are the person I trust with everything I built. Live peacefully, lead fairly. Never allow money to become louder than your conscience. The letter ended with a simple signature. Richard Whitmore. Nicole folded the pages carefully. She did not speak for nearly a minute. Finally, she asked quietly, "Why me?" Margaret answered honestly, "Because you never asked." Nicole looked confused. Margaret opened another folder. For nearly 15 years, Mr. Whitmore updated his estate plan several times. She slid copies across the table. Every revision left you as primary beneficiary. He believed anyone pursuing him because of his wealth would never truly value the responsibility attached to it. Nicole stared at the documents. There wasn't anyone else. There were charitable foundations, several distant relatives, senior executives, but no one received controlling ownership. Margaret spoke with complete certainty. You inherit virtually everything. Jonathan adjusted his glasses. What exactly does virtually everything include? Margaret opened the estate summary. Whitmore Capital Holdings. Commercial real estate in 12 states. Majority interests in healthcare technology companies. Renewable energy investments. Manufacturing partnerships. Private equity funds. Municipal bond portfolios. International trusts, she paused. The current estimated value exceeds $8.6 billion. The room became completely still. Nicole blinked once, then twice. She looked back toward Jonathan. There has to be a mistake. Jonathan slowly reviewed the probate certification. There doesn't appear to be. Nicole almost laughed. Not because anything felt amusing, because the number sounded impossible. My apartment costs less than $2,000 a month. Margaret smiled gently. Mr. Whitmore knew. I've driven the same car for 9 years. He knew that too. I don't even... Nicole stopped herself. She had no sentence capable of finishing the thought. Margaret reached into another folder. There is something important you should understand. This inheritance isn't simply money. Nicole listened carefully. It is responsibility. You now become the controlling owner of Whitmore Capital. There are over 22,000 employees whose futures depend on stable leadership. Nicole's expression immediately changed. The conversation had shifted from wealth to obligation. That language made sense to her. What happens first? Margaret exchanged a glance with Jonathan. The legal transfer process begins immediately. The operational transition will take several weeks. You'll meet accountants, tax specialists, corporate advisors, board members, investment managers. Nicole nodded slowly. I'll need to learn. Margaret smiled. That answer is exactly what Richard hoped to hear. Over the next several days, Nicole's schedule became unlike anything she had ever imagined. Every morning began with feeding her son. Every afternoon became a succession of legal briefings. She refused to allow meetings to interfere with her child's care. Whenever possible, Margaret arranged conference rooms equipped with private nursing spaces. No one objected. In fact, several senior advisors quietly admired Nicole's priorities. The first meeting introduced Evelyn Grant, Whitmore Capital's chief financial officer. Evelyn had worked beside Richard Whitmore for almost 28 years. She possessed the calm confidence of someone who understood billions of dollars without ever becoming impressed by them. She greeted Nicole warmly. Mr. Whitmore often said balance sheets tell you what a company owns. She smiled. But leadership tells you what a company becomes. Nicole appreciated the observation. I don't know enough yet. Evelyn answered immediately. You know enough to admit that. That's an excellent beginning. The following day introduced another key figure. Jonathan Pierce remained Nicole's personal attorney, but Whitmore Capital assigned its longtime general counsel, Daniel Mercer, to guide the corporate transition. Daniel explained every document patiently. Share structures, voting rights, trust governance, fiduciary obligations, board responsibilities. Nicole interrupted frequently, not because she disagreed, because she wanted to understand every paragraph before signing. She read slowly, asked questions, requested plain language explanations. Several meetings lasted twice as long because of her careful approach. No one complained. Richard Whitmore had always done exactly the same thing. Late one afternoon, Evelyn presented Nicole with projected personal income distributions. The figures occupied nearly an entire spreadsheet. Nicole looked at them for several moments before quietly pushing the papers back. I don't need this. Evelyn looked surprised. These are your scheduled distributions. Nicole nodded. I understand. But my life doesn't suddenly require 10 houses. It doesn't require private jets. It doesn't require luxury because numbers changed. Evelyn smiled. You sound remarkably like Richard. Nicole answered softly. I've only known him through a letter. Sometimes, Evelyn replied, that's enough. Meanwhile, Charles Bennett believed life was unfolding precisely according to plan. He had rented a downtown condominium closer to his office. His attorney, Daniel Foster, had begun drafting mediation proposals. Charles assumed Nicole would eventually accept a modest settlement. After all, she had no significant income. She was caring for a newborn. Extended litigation would surely become financially impossible. During one meeting, Daniel asked, Have you heard from your wife? Only through email. What does she say? Charles shrugged. Very little. Daniel frowned slightly. What kind of emails? Charles opened his phone. They're short. He read aloud. Please direct future legal communication through counsel. Daniel looked up. Counsel? Apparently, she hired an attorney. Charles laughed lightly. I don't know how she's planning to pay one. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Years of experience had taught him something. Clients who underestimated quiet opponents often regretted it. Across town, Nicole sat inside another conference room, reviewing trust governance documents. Margaret slid a thick binder toward her. This is the final transfer authorization. Nicole reached for her pen, then stopped. I have one question. Margaret smiled. I was wondering when you'd ask. Nicole looked directly at her. Why didn't my grandfather leave me all this while he was alive? Margaret's expression softened. He considered it. Many times. So why didn't he? Margaret took a careful breath. Because he wanted you to build your own character before inheriting his fortune. He believed wealth should confirm integrity, not create it. Nicole looked down at Richard's letter resting beside the documents. She understood, perhaps not completely, but enough. She signed. One signature, then another, then several more. Each witnessed, each notarized, each carefully recorded. There was no celebration, no applause, no champagne, only quiet professionalism. As the final document was placed into the completed file, Margaret closed the binder gently. It is done. Nicole nodded. Not proudly, not fearfully, simply accepting the responsibility now resting on her shoulders. Outside the conference room, her son began crying softly from the adjoining nursery where Olivia Brooks had been watching him during the meeting. Nicole immediately stood. The billion-dollar paperwork remained on the table. She walked first toward her child. Margaret watched her leave and smiled almost imperceptibly. Richard Whitmore had spent an entire lifetime searching for someone worthy of protecting everything he built. Watching Nicole cross the hallway without a second glance at the fortune she had just inherited, choosing instead to comfort her crying baby, Margaret quietly realized he had made the right decision. Nearly 6 weeks after Richard Whitmore's estate officially entered probate, Whitmore Capital Holdings began preparing for the largest leadership transition in its history. The news of Richard's passing had already reached financial circles across the country. Business journals published lengthy articles reviewing his career. Television analysts speculated endlessly about who would inherit control of the privately held investment empire. Some believed the board would appoint an interim chairman. Others predicted that one of Richard's longtime executives would assume permanent leadership. No one mentioned Nicole Thomas. Her name had never appeared in business magazines. She had never sought publicity. Richard had designed the succession process that way. Until every legal transfer had been completed, the identity of the controlling heir would remain confidential. Only a handful of attorneys, accountants, and board members knew the truth. Nicole preferred it that way. Every morning still began exactly the same. Her son woke shortly after 6. She prepared a bottle, changed diapers, and carried him to the apartment window, where sunlight slowly filled the room. For nearly an hour, the outside world disappeared. There were no billion-dollar portfolios, no corporate responsibilities, only a quiet mother whispering softly to her child. After Olivia Brooks arrived to help with childcare, Nicole traveled downtown for another series of meetings. She refused to hire a personal driver. Instead, she continued using her own aging sedan. When Margaret Collins gently suggested that increased security might eventually become necessary, Nicole agreed only after the transition became public. Right now, she explained, I'd rather remain invisible. Margaret understood. Visibility changed people. Nicole was determined not to let it change her. That Tuesday, she entered Whitmore Capital's headquarters for the first time. The building occupied nearly an entire city block in Boston's financial district. 42 stories of polished glass overlooked the harbor. Employees crossed the marble lobby, carrying laptops and coffee cups, unaware that the woman walking quietly through the entrance would soon become the company's controlling owner. Nicole wore a simple navy blazer over a cream blouse. No designer labels, no expensive jewelry. Only her wedding ring remained absent. A temporary visitor badge hung neatly from her jacket. Thomas Reynolds, chairman of Whitmore Capital's board of directors, greeted her personally in a private executive reception area. Thomas had spent 33 years working beside Richard Whitmore. His silver hair and measured voice reflected decades of experience, navigating financial crises without panic. He extended his hand warmly. "Welcome, Miss Thomas. Please call me Nicole." He smiled. Richard always insisted titles mattered less than integrity. I suppose he would approve. Nicole smiled politely. "I hope so." Thomas escorted her toward the executive boardroom. Along the hallway hung framed photographs documenting Whitmore Capital's history. Richard standing beside newly completed hospitals, factories, scholarship ceremonies, community redevelopment projects. Nicole slowed her pace. "I didn't realize the company invested in so many charitable programs." Thomas looked toward the photographs. "Most people don't. The newspapers preferred writing about acquisitions. Richard preferred talking about schools." Nicole quietly studied another photograph. An elementary library. Children reading. No reporters, no ceremony, just ordinary people benefiting from extraordinary generosity. She began understanding her grandfather differently. The boardroom itself felt surprisingly understated. Long walnut conference table, leather chairs, large windows overlooking Boston Harbor. No extravagant decoration. No unnecessary luxury. Only careful efficiency. Around the table sat 8 senior directors: Evelyn Grant, Daniel Mercer, Thomas Reynolds, several independent board members. Every person stood as Nicole entered. The gesture made her slightly uncomfortable. "Please," she said softly. "You don't need to stand." Thomas answered kindly. "We're standing because Richard would have." The meeting lasted almost 4 hours. Nicole expected presentations about profits. Instead, the directors focused first on responsibility. Employee retirement programs, healthcare benefits, long-term infrastructure investments, research funding. Only after discussing people did they discuss financial performance. Nicole appreciated that order. During a short break, Evelyn handed Nicole a confidential folder. "There is one matter requiring your review." Nicole opened it. Inside rested a proposal submitted by Bennett Strategic Consulting. She frowned. The name immediately caught her attention. Charles Bennett. His company had requested financing from Whitmore Capital to expand a series of corporate restructuring projects. Nicole slowly read the executive summary. Projected growth, revenue forecasts, capital requirements. She reached the final page before speaking. "When was this submitted?" 3 weeks ago, Evelyn replied. "Has anyone responded?" "Not yet." "Why?" Richard's passing temporarily delayed all major investment approvals. Nicole closed the folder. "What do you recommend?" Evelyn answered carefully. "Ordinarily, we'd complete our standard due diligence." Nicole nodded. "Then that's exactly what we'll do." Thomas watched quietly. "No special treatment." Nicole looked genuinely surprised. "Why would there be?" Thomas hesitated. Because it's your husband's company. Nicole corrected him gently. My husband's company should receive the same review as every other applicant. She paused. And if I become a conflict of interest? She slid the folder back across the table. I'll formally recuse myself. The directors exchanged brief glances. Thomas smiled, almost imperceptibly. Richard Whitmore had often insisted that integrity revealed itself most clearly when power offered shortcuts. Nicole had chosen the harder path without hesitation. Later that afternoon, Whitmore Capital's corporate finance department officially opened its standard review. No one outside the executive team knew why the file suddenly received careful attention. Across the country, Charles Bennett sat inside his own conference room, leading a presentation for investors. The expansion project represented one of the most important opportunities of his career. If Whitmore Capital approved financing his firm's valuation, could nearly double within 2 years. Charles spoke confidently. Graphs covered the large projection screen. Market forecasts, acquisition strategies, operational efficiencies. The meeting concluded with enthusiastic applause. Afterward, his chief operating officer, Rebecca Lawson, approached him. Any updates from Whitmore Capital? Charles shook his head. Nothing yet. They're probably overwhelmed after Whitmore's death. Rebecca nodded. Everyone says the succession has been unusually secretive. Charles laughed. Billionaires enjoy mystery. Neither of them realized how close the mystery already stood. That evening, Nicole attended another executive briefing. Daniel Mercer reviewed governance policies that Richard Whitmore had personally written years earlier. One section immediately captured Nicole's attention. Every investment exceeding $200 million required written justification, demonstrating not only financial benefit, but also measurable long-term community impact. Nicole looked up. That isn't common. Daniel smiled. No. Richard believed companies should improve the places where they earned money. Nicole carefully reread the policy. I'd like to keep this. Thomas answered immediately. So would every member of this board? The conversation then shifted toward pending acquisitions. Nicole listened far more than she spoke. Whenever analysts disagreed, she asked questions instead of choosing sides. By the end of the meeting, several directors privately remarked that she reminded them remarkably little of wealthy heirs they had encountered before. She never attempted to prove herself. She simply wanted to understand. Back in Chicago, Jonathan Pierce met Nicole by secure video conference. He reviewed developments in the separation proceedings. Charles's attorney has requested an early mediation session. Nicole nodded. I expected that. They appear to believe you'll accept a quick settlement. Nicole remained silent. Jonathan continued. I haven't disclosed anything regarding your inheritance. Good. I assumed that was your preference? It is. Jonathan leaned slightly toward the camera. I need to ask. Are you planning to reveal your financial position before mediation? Nicole thought carefully before answering. My inheritance has nothing to do with Charles's conduct. Jonathan smiled faintly. I was hoping you'd say that. The court should evaluate facts, not headlines. After ending the call, Nicole returned to reviewing another stack of corporate documents. Her phone buzzed. A message from Olivia. He finally smiled today. I think he knows exactly who his mom is. Attached was a photograph of her son laughing for the first time. Nicole's entire expression softened. She immediately closed the financial reports. Billions of dollars could wait. That smile could not. Hundreds of miles away, Charles ended his evening believing success was drawing closer. He had no reason to suspect that the investment proposal carrying his future ambitions now rested on the desk of the very woman he had abandoned in a hospital room. Even more importantly, he had no idea that Nicole had refused to use personal resentment against him. Instead, she had insisted his company receive the same objective review every other business deserved. It was a decision Richard Whitmore himself would have admired, and one that would soon make the truth impossible for anyone to dismiss. Nearly 2 months after Charles Bennett filed for legal separation, the case quietly entered its next phase. There were no dramatic courtroom confrontations, no raised voices, no emotional speeches. Instead, the process moved exactly as family law was designed to move through documents, deadlines, disclosures, and evidence. Nicole Thomas preferred it that way. She had long believed that people often spoke carelessly but signed carefully. If the truth existed, it would eventually appear on paper. One Monday morning, Jonathan Pierce spread several folders across the conference table inside his downtown Chicago office. Nicole arrived carrying only her notebook and a diaper bag. Olivia Brooks had volunteered to watch the baby in the reception area during the meeting. Jonathan smiled politely. "How's our youngest client?" Nicole returned the smile. "He slept almost 5 hours last night." "Congratulations. I've heard that's considered a major victory." "It is." The brief moment of normal conversation faded as Jonathan opened the first folder. "We've received Charles's preliminary financial disclosures." Nicole remained quiet. Jonathan continued. "As expected, they're incomplete." Nicole looked up. "Incomplete. Not necessarily false." He chose his words carefully. "But they leave several important questions unanswered." He slid copies across the table. "These are the financial statements submitted by Charles's attorney." Nicole reviewed them slowly. Annual salary, retirement accounts, primary residence, vehicle ownership, investment accounts. Everything appeared professionally organized. "What concerns you?" she asked. Jonathan placed another document beside the disclosures. "Compare these employment records." Nicole read both pages. Several compensation figures differed. One document referenced executive performance bonuses that did not appear anywhere in Charles's sworn disclosure. She frowned. Could this simply be timing? "It could," Jonathan nodded. "Which is why we don't assume misconduct. We verify." Nicole appreciated the distinction. Evidence before conclusions. Always. Jonathan continued. "I've already requested supporting documentation." "What have they provided?" "Excellent. And if they don't, then we ask the court to compel production." Nicole quietly wrote a note inside her notebook. "Never confuse missing information with proof." Jonathan noticed. "You still take notes." "I always will." He smiled. "I wish more clients did." By Wednesday, formal discovery requests had been exchanged. Charles's attorney, Daniel Foster, requested updated information regarding Nicole's employment medical recovery and future earning capacity. Jonathan prepared responses. At the same time, Nicole's legal team requested additional financial records from Charles. Corporate compensation statements, investment account histories, bonus documentation, stock purchase agreements, credit card records, business reimbursement reports. Nothing unusual, nothing excessive. Simply the documents required under Illinois family law. Across town, Daniel Foster reviewed the requests with Charles. Charles looked mildly irritated. "This seems excessive." Daniel shook his head. "It isn't. It's standard." Charles leaned back. "They already know what I earn." "They know what you've disclosed," Daniel corrected gently. "They're entitled to verify it." Charles sighed. "I'll have accounting send whatever they need." Daniel studied him carefully. Everything. Charles hesitated. What do you mean? I mean everything. The court expects complete disclosure. Charles looked away briefly. There are a few investment accounts that aren't really relevant. Daniel closed his notebook. Let me be very clear. His voice remained calm. If an account exists, we disclose it. Even if it has very little money. Yes. Even if Nicole never knew about it. Especially then. Charles nodded slowly. I understand. Daniel wasn't entirely convinced. Meanwhile, inside Whitmore Capital's headquarters, Nicole spent most of her days learning the business Richard Whitmore had spent a lifetime building. Every meeting revealed another layer of responsibility. Infrastructure financing, hospital partnerships, renewable energy investments, employee pension obligations. She quickly realized that billions of dollars were far less impressive than thousands of families depending on responsible decisions. One afternoon, Evelyn Grant entered Nicole's office carrying another report. This one isn't about the company. Nicole looked up. What is it? Your personal asset management strategy. Nicole laughed softly. I still can't believe those words apply to me. They do. Evelyn placed the folder on the desk. You don't have to make every decision immediately. I'm not planning to. Nicole opened the report. The first page listed multiple luxury property opportunities, private residences, vacation estates, international investments. She quietly closed the folder. I'm keeping the apartment. Evelyn looked surprised. For now. For as long as it makes sense. You own more homes than you'll ever visit. I know. Nicole smiled gently. But my son doesn't care where we live. He cares whether I'm there. Evelyn nodded with obvious respect. Richard Whitmore would have answered almost exactly the same way. Back in Chicago, Jonathan received another package of financial records from Charles's legal team. He spent nearly 2 hours comparing documents line by line. Then something caught his attention. Several electronic transfers appeared on corporate banking statements. The transfers themselves were legal. The destinations, however, required clarification. Jonathan called Nicole. Do you have a few minutes? Of course. I'd like you to come by tomorrow. Is something wrong? Not necessarily. I've simply found transactions I'd like explained. The following afternoon, Nicole arrived. Jonathan projected several bank statements onto a conference room screen. These transfers occurred approximately 6 weeks before your delivery. Nicole examined the dates. The amounts varied. $40,000, $75,000, $120,000. Each moved into newly established investment accounts. Were these hidden? Jonathan answered carefully. We don't know yet. Could there be legitimate explanations? Absolutely. Then why are we discussing them? Because they weren't included in Charles's financial disclosure. Nicole remained thoughtful. She never rushed toward conclusions. What do we do? Jonathan smiled faintly. The same thing we've done from the beginning. We ask questions. Within hours, formal requests for clarification were submitted. Jonathan also retained a forensic accounting specialist, not because fraud had been established, because financial tracing required technical expertise. 2 days later, Nicole met the accountant. His name was Samuel Ortiz. 25 years of experience analyzing complex financial records had given him remarkable patience. Samuel spread spreadsheets across the table. I don't investigate people. He smiled. I investigate numbers. Nicole appreciated the distinction. What exactly will you do? I'll compare disclosed assets with actual transaction histories. I'll identify inconsistencies. If there are innocent explanations. He shrugged lightly. I'll find those too. And if there aren't, I'll document only what can be proven. Nicole nodded. That's exactly what I want. Samuel spent the next several weeks reviewing thousands of pages. Bank statements, payroll records, brokerage histories, tax filings, corporate reimbursements. Nothing dramatic happened overnight. Truth rarely worked that way. Instead, patterns slowly emerged. Some executive bonuses appeared to have been redirected into accounts omitted from initial disclosures. Several investment purchases occurred shortly before Charles filed for separation. Large transfers coincided with consultations at Daniel Foster's law office. None of these facts alone proved wrongdoing. Together, however, they raised legitimate questions requiring answers. Jonathan remained cautious. We don't accuse, he reminded his entire team. We verify. Nicole never once asked whether Charles was guilty. Instead, she asked only one question. Can every statement be supported with documentation? Jonathan smiled. That's why you're an excellent client. At Whitmore Capital, another matter quietly reached Nicole's desk. The due diligence report on Bennett Strategic Consulting had progressed to its second review. Independent analysts praised the company's technical expertise. However, they also noted unusually aggressive executive compensation practices. Nothing illegal, simply observations. Thomas Reynolds entered Nicole's office that afternoon. The investment committee wants your opinion. Nicole looked at the report. I'll review the business. Thomas waited. And I won't review Charles. Thomas smiled. Richard would appreciate that answer. Nicole closed the file. If the company qualifies, it qualifies. If it doesn't, it doesn't. My personal life has no place in investment decisions. As evening settled over Chicago, Nicole returned to the apartment where Olivia was feeding the baby. Her son laughed as she entered. She immediately lifted him into her arms. The day's legal documents remained inside her briefcase near the door. She didn't touch them again that night. Instead, she sat quietly beside the window, rocking her son to sleep. Outside, autumn winds scattered golden leaves across the sidewalks. Inside, the apartment felt warm, peaceful, orderly. She had inherited billions. She was leading one of America's largest investment companies. She was preparing for a complex legal separation. Yet, the most important part of her day remained exactly the same. Holding the little boy who knew nothing about court filings, bank statements, or hidden accounts, he only knew that whenever he reached toward his mother, she was there. Far across the city, Samuel Ortiz continued reviewing another stack of financial records beneath the glow of a desk lamp. With each reconciled statement and every verified transfer, the timeline became a little clearer. Soon, the numbers themselves would begin telling a story that neither Charles nor anyone else could rewrite. Winter arrived quietly in Chicago. Snow dusted the sidewalks outside Jonathan Pierce's law office, and the city settled into the slower rhythm that often accompanied the holiday season. Inside the conference room, however, work continued with careful precision. Stacks of binders had gradually replaced the empty spaces on the shelves. Each binder carried a printed label: financial disclosures, employment records, bank statements, investment accounts, corporate compensation. Nicole Thomas looked at them without satisfaction. They represented necessity, nothing more. Jonathan entered, carrying another folder. We've received additional production. Nicole closed her notebook. From Charles. Yes. Did he answer everything? Jonathan placed the folder on the table. He answered. Whether he answered completely is another question. Nicole nodded. She had come to appreciate the difference. Samuel Ortiz arrived moments later carrying his laptop. The forensic accountant looked noticeably more serious than usual. "I've completed the first reconciliation." Jonathan looked toward him. "What did you find?" Samuel projected a spreadsheet onto the conference room screen. Rows of dates stretched across several months. Transfers, deposits, bonuses, brokerage activity, corporate reimbursements. Samuel pointed to one section. These executive bonuses were paid through Bennett Strategic Consulting. Nicole followed the highlighted entries. "They appear ordinary." "They do," Samuel agreed, "until we compare them with a sworn financial disclosure." He switched slides. The disclosed income listed substantially lower compensation. Nicole frowned slightly. "Could payroll have made an error?" Samuel shook his head. "I contacted the payroll administrator. They confirmed the higher figures." "So, why the difference?" "We don't know." Samuel answered carefully, "But someone omitted approximately $480,000 in compensation." Jonathan immediately added, "And we still aren't calling it fraud." Samuel smiled. "Correct. We're calling it an unexplained discrepancy." Nicole quietly wrote another sentence in her notebook. "Facts first, conclusions later." Jonathan noticed. "I think Richard Whitmore would have approved of that philosophy." Nicole smiled faintly. "I hope so." The investigation continued. Over the following week, Samuel traced additional transactions. Several investment accounts had been opened only 3 months before Nicole gave birth. The timing immediately drew his attention. Again, timing alone proved nothing. He requested supporting documentation. Brokerage agreements arrived 2 days later. Each account listed Charles Bennett as the sole owner. None had appeared in his initial disclosure. Samuel organized everything chronologically. Then he stopped. One transfer seemed unusually familiar. He opened another database. Compared dates, compared amounts. His eyebrows slowly lifted. Jonathan entered the office just as Samuel printed several pages. "You found something," Samuel nodded. "I found a pattern." "What kind?" Samuel spread the documents across the desk. Every major transfer occurred within 48 hours of one particular event. Jonathan studied the dates. Then he understood. "Meetings with Daniel Foster." Samuel nodded. "The consultation invoices match almost perfectly." Jonathan remained silent. Neither man rushed toward assumptions. Instead, Jonathan asked, "Can you prove the connection?" Samuel answered honestly. "No. I can prove timing. I cannot prove intent." Jonathan smiled. "Good. That's exactly how we'll present it." Across the city, Charles Bennett remained remarkably confident. His career had never been stronger. Despite delays from Whitmore Capital, several smaller investors had expressed interest in funding future expansion. During an executive strategy meeting, Rebecca Lawson reviewed quarterly projections. "If Whitmore approves financing," she said, "our valuation could increase dramatically." Charles leaned back comfortably. "They will." Rebecca looked uncertain. "They've been unusually slow." "They're restructuring after Whitmore's death." Charles dismissed the concern. "Eventually they'll need profitable opportunities. Our proposal is one of them." Rebecca nodded politely. She hoped he was right. That afternoon, Charles received an email from Daniel Foster. Additional financial clarification requested. Charles sighed. He called immediately. "Daniel, we've already sent everything." Daniel's voice remained calm. They're asking about several brokerage accounts. Charles became quiet. I forgot about those. Daniel paused. You forgot. They're small. Charles. Daniel spoke carefully. I need complete honesty. They're not asking whether the accounts matter. They're asking whether they exist. Charles rubbed his forehead. I'll send the statements. Please do. And from this point forward, Daniel hesitated. Do not describe anything as unimportant until I review it. Charles reluctantly agreed. Several hours later, Jonathan received the additional statements. Samuel immediately incorporated them into his analysis. Instead of resolving inconsistencies, the new documents created more questions. Some account balances exceeded earlier estimates. Others reflected investment purchases funded shortly before Charles served Nicole with separation papers. Again, none of it automatically established misconduct. But the timeline continued growing more complicated. Meanwhile, another source of information quietly emerged. Rebecca Lawson had worked with Charles for nearly 6 years. She respected his intelligence. She admired his ambition. Lately, however, she had begun remembering conversations that once seemed insignificant. Months before Nicole delivered their son, Charles often remained late at the office. One evening, after most employees had gone home, Rebecca had entered the executive conference room, searching for forgotten files. Charles had been speaking with another senior manager. Neither noticed her standing outside the partially open door. I can't keep pretending. Charles had sounded tired. As soon as the baby's born. His sentence faded beneath the closing elevator doors before Rebecca heard the rest. At the time, she thought little about it. Now, with the separation becoming public, the memory returned. She reviewed archived corporate meeting schedules. One particular executive planning session had been automatically recorded through the company's internal conferencing system because several remote participants had joined online. Company policy required such recordings for accurate meeting minutes. Rebecca requested access from the Information Technology Department. The recording remained stored exactly as company policy required. She listened carefully. Most of the meeting concerned budgets and staffing. Near the end, after several participants disconnected, a few executives remained speaking informally while the recording continued. Charles's voice became unmistakable. I'll wait until after the delivery. Another executive laughed softly. You've already decided. I decided months ago. I just don't want unnecessary complications before the baby's here. The recording ended shortly afterward. Rebecca sat motionless. She replayed the conversation twice. No one discussed legal strategy. No one mentioned finances. But the timeline matched what Charles had admitted inside Nicole's hospital room. Rebecca immediately contacted corporate legal counsel. Daniel Mercer answered personally. She explained what she had discovered. Daniel listened without interruption. Finally, he asked, was the recording created in accordance with company policy? Yes. Has it been altered? No. Do you still have the original server file? Yes. Daniel thanked her. I'll need to preserve it. Within 24 hours, the recording was secured under formal chain of custody procedures. Daniel Mercer contacted Jonathan Pierce. I may have evidence relevant to your case. Jonathan asked only one question. Can it be authenticated? It already has been. Jonathan immediately arranged independent forensic verification. Nicole learned about the recording only after the authentication process had begun. Jonathan carefully explained everything. We're not relying on memory. We're relying on preserved digital evidence. Nicole remained thoughtful. So he really decided before our son was born? Jonathan answered quietly. It appears so. Nicole lowered her eyes. She did not appear angry, only saddened. I hoped... She stopped. Jonathan waited. I hoped the hospital wasn't where he first made the decision. Jonathan understood. But it wasn't. No, it wasn't. Later that evening, Nicole attended another Whitmore Capital Board dinner. Conversations centered on healthcare investments and employee education initiatives. Thomas Reynolds eventually asked, "How are you managing everything?" Nicole smiled gently. "One day at a time." "And the legal case?" "I'm letting the process work." Thomas nodded approvingly. Richard often said the strongest position in any negotiation belongs to the person who doesn't need to rush. Nicole thought about that during the drive home. Rush. Charles had rushed to end a marriage. She had chosen patience. Charles had assumed incomplete information favored him. She had insisted every fact be verified before drawing conclusions. Charles believed silence meant weakness. She had discovered silence often allowed the truth enough room to appear. That night, after feeding her son, Nicole opened her notebook once again. She wrote only one sentence. The truth is beginning to organize itself. She closed the notebook and switched off the bedside lamp. Across the city, Samuel Ortiz finished preparing his updated financial timeline. Jonathan Pierce reviewed the authenticated audio certification. Daniel Mercer secured corporate affidavits. Each document, each timestamp, each bank record, each preserved recording. Individually, they appeared ordinary. Together, they were quietly becoming something much more powerful. Not revenge, not accusation. Evidence. And evidence, once properly assembled, rarely needed anyone to raise their voice. The first substantive court hearing took place on a gray January morning. Snow had fallen throughout the previous night, leaving the sidewalks around the courthouse covered in a thin layer of ice. Lawyers hurried through the entrance carrying leather briefcases. Clients whispered nervously in waiting areas, and security officers guided everyone through the same orderly procedures. For most people inside the building, it was simply another work day. For Nicole Thomas and Charles Bennett, it marked the first time they had stood in the same courtroom since Charles had delivered the separation papers in her hospital room. Nicole arrived 20 minutes early. She wore a dark charcoal suit, a simple pearl necklace, and carried only a slim portfolio containing her notebook and several legal documents. Olivia Brooks had volunteered once again to care for Nicole's son during the hearing. Jonathan Pierce met her outside courtroom 7B. "How are you feeling?" he asked. Nicole smiled politely. "Prepared." "Nervous?" "A little." "That's normal." Jonathan looked toward the courtroom doors. "Remember, today isn't about winning. It's about establishing the record." Nicole nodded. "I understand." Across the hallway, Charles entered with Daniel Foster. Charles appeared confident. His tailored overcoat and expensive briefcase reflected the polished image he had carefully cultivated throughout his career. He noticed Nicole almost immediately. For several seconds, he considered walking over. Instead, he simply nodded. Nicole returned the gesture. Neither spoke. There was no visible hostility, only distance. Daniel quietly handed Charles another folder. "The judge may ask about the supplemental financial disclosures." "I've reviewed everything." "Good." "And the investment accounts?" "I disclosed them." Daniel looked directly at him. "Completely," Charles answered without hesitation. "Yes." Daniel wanted to believe him. At precisely 9 o'clock, the courtroom doors opened. Judge Eleanor Watkins entered moments later. She had served on the family court bench for nearly 18 years and had developed a reputation for patience, precision, and an unwavering insistence on complete financial transparency. Everyone stood. After brief introductions, the hearing began. This matter concerns temporary issues and discovery compliance, Judge Watkins said calmly. I am not deciding final property distribution today. She looked toward both attorneys. My expectation is straightforward. Complete disclosure. No surprises. No games. Jonathan stood first. Your Honor, Miss Thomas has complied fully with every discovery request. He handed several binders to the court clerk. We have also provided updated medical documentation regarding her recovery and childcare responsibilities. Judge Watkins nodded. Thank you. Daniel Foster rose next. Mr. Bennett has likewise supplemented his disclosures in response to opposing counsel's requests. He submitted another packet. The parties continue cooperating. Jonathan remained silent, for the moment. The judge reviewed several pages, then looked toward Jonathan. I understand there remain questions regarding financial completeness. Yes, Your Honor. Jonathan approached the podium. We are not alleging misconduct at this stage. We are requesting additional clarification. Judge Watkins appreciated the careful wording. What clarification? Jonathan opened one binder. Our forensic review identified discrepancies between disclosed executive compensation and employer payroll records. He paused. We also identified several brokerage accounts omitted from the initial disclosure. Daniel immediately responded. Those accounts have since been disclosed. Jonathan nodded. They have. Our concern is not merely their existence. It is the accuracy of the original filing. Judge Watkins looked toward Daniel. Explanation, Daniel answered calmly. The omissions were corrected voluntarily. My client supplemented his disclosures before today's hearing. The judge turned toward Charles. Mr. Bennett? Charles stood. Were the original disclosures complete when filed? Charles hesitated for barely a second. They were complete to the best of my knowledge. Jonathan quietly made a note. Judge Watkins continued. When did you become aware of the omitted accounts? Charles answered. When my attorney reviewed additional records. The judge accepted the response without comment. She simply wrote several notes of her own. The hearing moved to scheduling matters. Discovery deadlines, expert reports, future depositions. Then Jonathan requested permission to introduce a preliminary summary prepared by forensic accountant Samuel Ortiz. Daniel immediately objected. Your Honor, the investigation remains incomplete. Jonathan agreed. It does. We are not requesting findings. We merely ask that the court recognize ongoing forensic review. Judge Watkins considered the request. Granted. The report will be accepted solely for procedural purposes. No factual findings are made today. Samuel approached the witness stand. He had testified in courts many times before. His voice remained steady. My assignment was to reconcile financial disclosures with available banking and payroll records. Jonathan asked, have you reached final conclusions? No. Have you identified areas requiring additional documentation? Yes. Samuel explained the methodology in careful detail. Independent verification, transaction tracing, payroll reconciliation, investment account analysis. Every answer emphasized process rather than accusation. Judge Watkins listened attentively. Daniel cross-examined briefly. Mr. Ortiz, can you state today that Mr. Bennett intentionally concealed assets? Samuel answered immediately. No. Can you state that any transfer you've reviewed was illegal? No. What can you state? Samuel looked directly at the judge. I can state that additional documentation is necessary before reliable conclusions may be reached. Judge Watkins gave a slight nod. Professional, objective. Exactly the answer she expected from an experienced expert. After Samuel stepped down, Jonathan requested another matter be placed under seal. We anticipate presenting authenticated digital evidence at a later hearing. Daniel looked surprised. What evidence? Jonathan remained respectful. Out of fairness, opposing counsel will receive complete disclosure before any evidentiary proceeding. Judge Watkins approved the request. The courtroom moved on. Throughout the hearing, Nicole remained almost entirely silent. She answered only 3 questions: her current residence, her employment status, confirmation that she was caring for the party's infant son. Every answer lasted only a few words. No speeches, no complaints, no personal criticism. Judge Watkins noticed. So did nearly everyone else. During a short recess, Charles finally approached Nicole in the hallway. I didn't expect this many lawyers. Nicole looked at him calmly. Neither did I. Charles shifted awkwardly. You could have called. She considered the statement. We're communicating through counsel. That's what you requested? Charles had no response. For a moment, they simply stood in silence. Finally, he asked, How's the baby? Nicole's expression softened. He's healthy. I'm glad. She nodded. So am I. Nothing more was said. Jonathan soon returned. The judge is ready. Charles watched Nicole walk back into the courtroom. He couldn't explain why the brief conversation unsettled him. She hadn't accused him. She hadn't argued. She hadn't even sounded angry. She simply seemed different, calmer, more certain. The afternoon session focused primarily on scheduling future discovery. Judge Watkins established firm deadlines for document production and depositions. Before concluding, she addressed both parties directly. I want to be clear. She removed her glasses. This court expects complete honesty. If additional documents exist, produce them. If additional accounts exist, disclose them. If either party attempts to delay or obscure relevant information, the consequences will be significant. She looked first at Jonathan, then Daniel. I expect cooperation. Both attorneys agreed. The hearing adjourned shortly afterward. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited for unrelated criminal proceedings. No cameras followed Nicole. She preferred it that way. Jonathan walked beside her toward the parking garage. Today went well. Nicole asked, Because we won? Jonathan smiled. No. Because the process worked. They're paying attention. Nicole nodded thoughtfully. I noticed. Meanwhile, Daniel and Charles returned to their office. Daniel closed the conference room door before speaking. I need to ask you something. Charles looked up. What? Is there anything else I don't know? Charles frowned. I've told you everything. Daniel held his gaze. I hope that's true. Because opposing counsel seems remarkably patient. What does that mean? It means they aren't guessing. Daniel spoke carefully. They're building. Charles dismissed the concern with a wave of his hand. They don't have anything. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he remembered Samuel Ortiz's testimony. Not dramatic, not emotional, simply methodical. Lawyers often feared emotional opponents far less than organized ones. Across the country in Boston, Nicole joined the Whitmore Capital Board by secure video conference later that evening. Thomas Reynolds welcomed her warmly. The hearing. It was productive, Nicole answered. No major developments. Thomas smiled. Sometimes the quiet days matter most. Nicole looked at the agenda before her. hospital expansion funding, scholarship grants, infrastructure investments. Life moved forward. Courtrooms addressed the past. Leadership required attention to the future. As the meeting concluded, Nicole glanced briefly at the framed copy of Richard Whitmore's handwritten letter resting on the bookshelf behind her desk. One sentence quietly returned to her thoughts. Lead fairly. That was exactly what she intended to do, whether inside a courtroom or a boardroom. And although Charles still believed the legal process remained under control, the evidence gathering continued quietly beyond the courtroom walls. Bank records were still being reconciled. Digital files were still being authenticated. Emails were still being preserved. The hearing had ended. The case, however, had only begun to reveal its true shape. By early February, the legal transfer of Richard Whitmore's estate had reached its final stage. The probate court had approved every major provision without challenge. Corporate ownership certificates had been updated. Trust governance had been completed. Voting authority had been transferred. For the first time in its history, Whitmore Capital Holdings officially had a new controlling owner. Until now, only a small circle of executives, attorneys, and advisors had known her identity. That was about to change. Thomas Reynolds scheduled a special meeting of the board of directors. The agenda distributed to senior executives appeared routine. Corporate governance update, succession confirmation, pending investment approvals. Among the investment proposals scheduled for discussion was one familiar file: Bennett Strategic Consulting. Charles Bennett received the invitation 3 weeks in advance. As chief executive of his growing consulting firm, he had been asked to present his expansion proposal personally before the investment committee. Whitmore Capital's financing would determine whether his company could pursue a series of acquisitions he had spent nearly 2 years planning. He considered it the opportunity of a lifetime. Rebecca Lawson shared his optimism. Our presentation is solid. Charles adjusted his tie while reviewing the final slides. Revenue growth, risk management, operational forecasts. We've covered everything. Rebecca smiled. The committee will have questions. They always do. Charles closed his laptop. We'll answer them. He had no reason to expect anything unusual. Meanwhile, several floors above Whitmore Capital's executive offices, Nicole Thomas sat quietly inside Thomas Reynolds' office. Large windows overlooked Boston Harbor. Cargo ships moved slowly across the gray winter water while snow drifted softly beyond the glass. Nicole reviewed the meeting agenda one final time. Thomas poured 2 cups of coffee. Nervous, she smiled honestly. A little. You should be. He sat across from her. So was Richard before every annual meeting. Nicole laughed softly. I doubt that. Thomas reached into a drawer. Without speaking, he removed a faded photograph. Richard Whitmore stood beside the same boardroom table nearly 30 years earlier. His expression looked remarkably serious. He always appeared confident. Thomas smiled. He was. But confidence and nervousness aren't opposites. Nicole studied the photograph. I still don't feel like I belong here. Thomas answered gently. Richard spent decades preparing companies. Not successors? You're doing something much harder. Nicole looked toward the boardroom doors. I'm afraid they'll expect someone extraordinary. Thomas shook his head. They're expecting someone responsible. There's an important difference. At 10 o'clock, sharp board members began arriving. Evelyn Grant, Daniel Mercer, independent directors, division presidents, outside guests, investment applicants. Charles Bennett entered shortly afterward with Rebecca Lawson. The reception staff escorted them toward a waiting conference room adjacent to the executive boardroom. Everything appeared impeccably organized. Coffee service, presentation equipment, printed agendas. No indication that anything unusual would happen. Rebecca glanced around. I've heard no one outside the board has met the new controlling owner. Charles smiled. Billionaires enjoy dramatic entrances. Neither noticed Thomas Reynolds walking past the hallway moments later. Inside the executive boardroom, Nicole stood near the windows, reviewing one final document with Margaret Collins. Margaret carefully organized several certified probate records, corporate resolutions, ownership certificates, court confirmations. Everything required to formally recognize Nicole before the full board. Margaret looked up. Once we begin, there's no reason to delay. Nicole nodded. I understand. You don't have to make a speech. I wasn't planning to. Margaret smiled. I didn't think you were. At precisely 10:30, Thomas Reynolds called the meeting to order. The directors took their seats. Minutes were approved. Routine governance matters concluded. Then Thomas looked around the room. Our next agenda item concerns the succession of Whitmore Capital Holdings. Every conversation stopped. Thomas continued calmly. As each of you knows, Richard Whitmore left detailed instructions regarding the future governance of this organization. He nodded toward Margaret Collins. Counsel. Margaret stood. She spoke with quiet precision. The probate court has now completed all required proceedings. The estate transfer is final. She lifted a certified document. The controlling ownership of Whitmore Capital Holdings has legally passed according to Richard Whitmore's final will and testament. Several directors leaned forward. Even those already familiar with the decision recognized the importance of the moment. Margaret looked toward the doorway. Please join us. The doors opened. Nicole entered alone. She wore the same understated navy suit she had chosen for court several weeks earlier. No expensive jewelry, no entourage, no theatrical entrance. She simply walked calmly toward the head of the table. Charles happened to glance through the interior glass wall separating the waiting conference room from the executive boardroom. At first, he assumed he had mistaken someone else for Nicole. He looked again. His expression slowly changed. Rebecca followed his gaze. Isn't that... Charles didn't answer. Inside the boardroom, Thomas Reynolds smiled warmly. Ladies and gentlemen. He paused briefly. It is my honor to introduce Miss Nicole Thomas, our new chair and controlling owner of Whitmore Capital Holdings. Silence filled the room. Not awkward silence, respectful silence. Nicole looked around the table. Many faces were unfamiliar. Others offered warm smiles of encouragement. She spoke only after everyone had settled. Thank you. Her voice remained steady. I know many of you worked beside Richard Whitmore for decades. I won't pretend I can replace him. A few directors exchanged approving glances. Nicole continued, My responsibility isn't to become Richard. It's to protect what he spent his lifetime building. No applause followed. None was needed. Thomas Reynolds simply nodded once. The meeting proceeded immediately into business. There was no celebration, no ceremonial presentation. Exactly as Richard Whitmore had instructed. Several routine investment matters were approved. Healthcare expansion, manufacturing modernization, employee retirement adjustments. Then Evelyn Grant opened the next file. Bennett Strategic Consulting. Rebecca Lawson straightened in her chair. Charles quietly gathered his presentation materials before being invited into the boardroom. The doors opened. He entered confidently. His first step carried him toward the presentation screen. His second brought his eyes across the board table. His third stopped completely. Nicole sat at the head of the table. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Charles stared. Nicole met his eyes calmly. No anger, no satisfaction, only quiet professionalism. Thomas Reynolds broke the silence. "Mr. Bennett, please begin whenever you're ready." Charles struggled to recover. "You?" He stopped himself. Nicole answered politely. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett." Her tone reflected exactly the same professionalism she had shown every other presenter. Nothing more, nothing less. Charles looked around the room. No one appeared surprised, which meant everyone else already knew. He suddenly realized he was the last person to understand what had happened. Rebecca quietly touched his arm. "We should continue." Charles nodded stiffly. He somehow completed the first several slides. Revenue projections, market expansion, operating margins. His voice gradually steadied. Nicole listened carefully. She took notes, asked no unusual questions. When Charles finished, Thomas Reynolds thanked him. "The committee appreciates your presentation." Nicole finally spoke. "Mr. Bennett." Charles looked toward her. "Your proposal has completed only part of our due diligence process. Our investment committee still requires additional financial review before making any recommendation." Charles swallowed. "I understand." Nicole continued. "The review will proceed according to standard Whitmore capital policy. No faster, no slower. The same standards apply to every applicant." Another silence settled over the room. Charles realized something unexpected. Nicole had not embarrassed him. She could have revealed everything. She could have commented on their separation. She could have allowed personal history to dominate the meeting. Instead, she behaved exactly as if he were simply another executive seeking financing. That restraint unsettled him far more than public humiliation ever could have. After Charles and Rebecca left the room, one independent director looked toward Nicole. "You handled that exceptionally well." Nicole answered quietly, "My personal circumstances aren't corporate policy." Thomas Reynolds smiled. "Richard once said the easiest abuse of power is using it where no one can stop you." Nicole closed the investment folder. "I don't intend to begin that habit." The meeting continued. Outside the building, Charles stood on the front steps overlooking the frozen harbor. For the first time since leaving Nicole in the hospital, certainty disappeared. He replayed the boardroom again and again in his mind. Nicole hadn't looked victorious. She hadn't looked angry. She had looked exactly like someone who belonged there. And somehow, that realization was far more difficult to accept than the inheritance itself. He still didn't know the full extent of Richard Whitmore's estate. He still knew nothing about the evidence quietly accumulating in the family court case. But one truth had become impossible to deny. The woman he believed had become dependent on him had walked into one of the most powerful boardrooms in the country without needing anything from him at all. And that realization marked the beginning of a very different kind of reckoning. The second major evidentiary hearing was scheduled for the final week of February. Unlike the earlier procedural session, this hearing would focus on evidence. Not conclusions, not final judgment. Simply the admissibility and credibility of the documents both parties intended to rely upon. For Jonathan Pierce, preparation had occupied nearly every day of the previous month. For Nicole Thomas, preparation had followed a different rhythm. She spent mornings with her son, afternoons leading Whitmore Capital, evenings reviewing legal updates after her child had fallen asleep. She refused to let the lawsuit become the center of her life. It was an important chapter. It would not become her entire story. On the morning of the hearing, Jonathan met Nicole outside the courthouse. He carried 4 carefully organized binders. Each bore a single label: financial evidence, digital evidence, witness certifications, discovery timeline. Nicole looked at the stack. Everything, Jonathan nodded. Everything we're presenting today. She smiled faintly. It doesn't feel dramatic. It shouldn't, Jonathan answered. The strongest evidence rarely is. Inside courtroom 7, Judge Eleanor Watkins reviewed the docket while attorneys arranged exhibits on separate counsel tables. Charles Bennett arrived several minutes later with Daniel Foster. He appeared composed, although noticeably more reserved than during the previous hearing. The Whitmore Capital Board meeting had changed something. Since discovering Nicole's inheritance, he had begun viewing every legal development differently. Daniel leaned toward him. Today we answer questions. We don't speculate. Charles nodded. I understand. The hearing began promptly. Judge Watkins addressed both sides. My understanding is that several categories of documentary evidence are now complete. Jonathan stood. Yes, Your Honor. We are prepared to authenticate financial records, electronic correspondence, and certain digital materials. Daniel rose as well. We reserve objections where appropriate. The judge nodded. As expected. Jonathan called Samuel Ortiz as the first witness. Samuel carried only a thin binder. Months of forensic accounting had been distilled into a clear timeline supported by certified records. After being sworn in, he explained his qualifications. 26 years in forensic accounting, court-appointed expert in numerous jurisdictions, certified fraud examiner, specialist in financial tracing. Jonathan began carefully. Mr. Ortiz, were you asked to determine whether Mr. Bennett committed fraud? No. What were you asked to do? Reconcile disclosed financial information with independently verified financial records. Did you do so? Yes. Samuel projected the first exhibit onto the courtroom screen. A timeline appeared. Executive compensation, payroll deposits, investment transfers, brokerage activity, discovery disclosures. Every entry referenced certified banking records or employer documentation. No speculation appeared anywhere. Jonathan asked, did the compensation reported in Mr. Bennett's original disclosure match employer payroll records? Samuel answered calmly. No. What difference did you identify? Approximately $482,000. Daniel immediately stood. Objection. The characterization is incomplete. Judge Watkins looked toward Samuel. Clarify. Samuel nodded. The compensation was ultimately disclosed through supplemental filings. My testimony concerns only the original disclosure. Nothing more. The judge overruled the objection. The clarification is sufficient. Jonathan continued. Were additional brokerage accounts identified during your review? Yes. Were those accounts initially disclosed? No. Were they later disclosed? Yes. Jonathan paused. Have you expressed any opinion regarding intent? No. Why not? Because intent is a legal conclusion. My responsibility ends with verified financial facts. Judge Watkins wrote several notes. Professional restraint strengthened credibility far more than dramatic accusations ever could. Next, Jonathan introduced certified banking records. Every document had been obtained through lawful discovery. Every page bore official certifications, dates, transfer amounts, account numbers, nothing emotional, only records. Daniel cross-examined carefully. Mr. Ortiz, are hidden bank accounts automatically evidence of wrongdoing? No. Can delayed disclosure occur without fraudulent intent? Yes. So, your testimony does not establish deception. Samuel answered precisely. My testimony establishes discrepancies requiring explanation. Daniel nodded. No further questions. The next witness proved more significant. Daniel Mercer, General Counsel of Whitmore Capital Holdings, approached the witness stand. Jonathan began with foundation questions. Mr. Mercer, are executive meetings at Whitmore Capital sometimes recorded? Yes. For what purpose? Accurate meeting documentation, particularly when remote participants attend. Were such recordings created according to ordinary business policy? Yes. Jonathan introduced a chain of custody certification, server logs, retention policies, information technology affidavits, digital authentication reports. Every procedural requirement had been satisfied. Judge Watkins examined the documents carefully. Daniel Foster reviewed them as well. Jonathan then asked, did your office preserve one particular executive meeting recording? Yes. Why? Because portions became potentially relevant after lawful discovery requests. Daniel objected. Hearsay. Jonathan responded immediately. We're not offering the recording for truth at this stage. We're authenticating business records. Judge Watkins considered the issue. Authentication permitted. Weight will be determined later. Daniel Mercer stepped away. Jonathan called the digital forensic examiner who had independently verified the recording. The expert explained metadata, timestamps, server integrity, hash verification. No edits, no alterations, no missing segments. Everything matched the original system archive. Only then did Jonathan request permission to play a brief excerpt. Judge Watkins looked toward Daniel. Objection. Daniel hesitated. Finally, he answered, no objection to authenticity. The court may consider the recording subject to later argument. The courtroom became completely silent. Jonathan pressed play. Static filled the speakers for only a moment. Then ordinary office conversation, budget discussions, scheduling, routine executive matters. Near the end, after several participants disconnected, Charles's voice became clear. I'll wait until after the delivery. Another voice answered. You've already decided, Charles replied. I decided months ago. I just don't want unnecessary complications before the baby's here. The recording ended. No one spoke immediately. Judge Watkins looked toward Jonathan. Anything further? No, Your Honor. Daniel Foster slowly stood. His cross-examination remained brief. The recording contains no discussion of finances. Correct. No discussion of property. Correct. No discussion of legal misconduct. Correct. Daniel turned toward the judge. It establishes timing. Nothing more. Jonathan agreed. Precisely. Timing. Nothing more. Nothing less. Nicole remained perfectly still throughout the testimony. She did not look toward Charles. She did not react when the recording played. Her eyes remained fixed on the notebook resting before her. Judge Watkins eventually addressed Charles directly. Mr. Bennett? Charles stood. Do you dispute making those statements? He hesitated. No. Do you dispute that you had decided to pursue separation before the birth of your son? No. The judge nodded once. Very well. Charles sat again. Across the courtroom, Jonathan quietly marked another item completed. Not because Charles had admitted wrongdoing, because facts no longer required argument. The afternoon session shifted toward electronic correspondence. Jonathan introduced several authenticated emails exchanged between Charles and financial advisors before Nicole gave birth. Unlike the audio recording, the emails contained no dramatic language. Instead, they revealed planning, scheduling, requests for financial summaries, preparation of asset inventories, meeting confirmations with Daniel Foster's office. Every email had been produced during discovery. Every one was authenticated. Jonathan never suggested that consulting a lawyer was improper. It wasn't. Instead, he established chronology. Planning had begun months before delivery. Judge Watkins appreciated the distinction. After reviewing the exhibits, she addressed both attorneys. This court draws no conclusions today regarding ultimate property division. She looked at Jonathan. Your evidence has been properly organized. Then toward Daniel. Your objections have been appropriately preserved. Finally, she looked at Charles. Mr. Bennett. He stood again. The court encourages complete candor going forward. If additional information exists, disclose it promptly. I will, Your Honor. The judge nodded. I hope so. The hearing adjourned shortly afterward. Outside the courtroom, reporters hurried past without recognizing anyone involved. The case attracted no headlines. It didn't need them. Jonathan and Nicole walked quietly toward the parking garage. Neither spoke until they reached the elevator. Finally, Nicole asked, "Was today important?" Jonathan smiled. "Very. Because of the recording." "Not only that." He pressed the elevator button. "Because every piece now supports every other piece. The bank records, the emails, the timeline, the testimony. They fit." Nicole nodded thoughtfully. "I always believed the truth would eventually become consistent." Jonathan looked at her. "That's exactly what's happening." Across the courthouse plaza, Charles stood alone beside his car. Daniel joined him moments later. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Charles broke the silence. "I didn't think any of that mattered." Daniel answered honestly. "Individually? Very little." He looked back toward the courthouse. Together, he paused. They begin telling a story. Charles lowered his eyes. For the first time since filing for separation, he understood that the case no longer depended on what either side claimed. It depended on what could be documented. And documents, unlike emotions, rarely change their minds. March arrived with the first signs of spring. Snow still lingered in shaded corners of Chicago, but the harsh winds of winter had begun to fade. Small patches of green appeared beneath bare trees, reminding everyone that even the longest seasons eventually changed. Nicole Thomas noticed the change one morning while pushing her son's stroller through a neighborhood park. He laughed every time a pair of ducks crossed the walking path. Nicole smiled. The sound of his laughter remained the most welcome interruption to every difficult day. Her phone vibrated. Jonathan Pierce. "Good morning," she answered. "I have news." She slowed the stroller. "Good news?" "I believe so. The court has scheduled the final evidentiary hearing before judgment." "When?" 3 weeks. Nicole looked down at her son. "I'll be there." "You won't need to do much," Jonathan replied. "The evidence is already where it needs to be." Nicole thanked him before ending the call. She had learned something over the previous months. Waiting no longer frightened her. Preparation replaced fear. That afternoon, Whitmore Capital's executive board gathered for its quarterly strategic meeting. Nicole chaired the meeting with the same quiet discipline she had shown since assuming leadership. The agenda covered hospital expansion projects in rural communities, renewable energy investments, and employee scholarship programs. Only after 3 hours of discussion did Thomas Reynolds quietly mention another subject. Bennett Strategic Consulting. Nicole nodded. The due diligence report, Evelyn Grant opened the file. It has been completed. Nicole looked around the table. I'd prefer someone else summarize it. Thomas understood immediately. Conflict avoidance. Nicole answered simply, yes. Thomas reviewed the findings himself. The company demonstrates strong operational performance. However, analysts identified unusually aggressive executive compensation practices. No violations of law. No accounting irregularities affecting the company. He closed the report. The committee recommends postponing any investment until the ongoing family court proceedings conclude. Nicole nodded. That seems reasonable. One director looked toward her. Would you like the board to reject the proposal entirely? Nicole answered without hesitation. No. The room became quiet. Thomas smiled slightly. May I ask why? Nicole folded her hands. Because personal circumstances should not determine corporate decisions. If the company remains qualified after independent review, it deserves objective consideration. If it does not qualify, then the answer should still be based on business. The board unanimously agreed. No one mentioned Charles again. Across the country, Charles sat alone inside his downtown office, reviewing another disappointing email. Whitmore Capital had officially delayed its investment decision. Not rejected, simply postponed. Ordinarily, he would have viewed the delay as frustrating. Now it felt different. He knew exactly who sat behind the final approval process. Yet Nicole had never interfered. She had not used the company to punish him. That realization unsettled him more each passing day. Rebecca Lawson knocked gently before entering. You have a minute. Charles nodded. She closed the door behind her. I've been thinking about something. What is it? Rebecca hesitated. I owe you honesty. Charles looked confused. About what? The recorded executive meeting. His expression changed immediately. You were the one who preserved it. Yes. You could have deleted it. Rebecca shook her head. It wasn't mine to delete. It belonged to the company. Charles lowered his eyes. I know. Rebecca continued quietly. I didn't do it to hurt you. I did it because once lawyers became involved, it became evidence. Charles leaned back heavily. I'm beginning to understand that. Rebecca stood. I hope everything works out. So do I. After she left, Charles remained alone for several minutes. His office looked exactly as it always had. Awards, certificates, industry recognition, photographs from business conferences. For years he had measured success by everything hanging on those walls. Now they seemed strangely unimportant. Meanwhile, Jonathan Pierce spent long evenings organizing the final trial notebooks. Each exhibit occupied a numbered tab. Hospital visitor logs, medical records, payroll statements, bank records, brokerage histories, email correspondence, audio authentication, corporate affidavits. Nothing had been added at the last minute. There were no surprise witnesses, no dramatic revelations, only months of careful preparation. Samuel Ortiz entered Jonathan's office carrying one final report. I've completed the reconciliation. Jonathan looked up. Everything, Samuel nodded. Every known account. Any remaining discrepancies? Samuel smiled faintly. No. The financial timeline is complete. Jonathan reviewed the report carefully. So the transfers? Documented. The bonuses? Verified. The supplemental disclosures? Integrated. Samuel closed his laptop. I don't believe there's anything else to discover. Jonathan extended his hand. Excellent work. Samuel shook it. The numbers simply told their story. The morning of the final hearing arrived, under clear blue skies. Unlike previous appearances, Nicole felt remarkably calm. She wore the same charcoal suit she had chosen for the first hearing, not because she wished to make a statement, because she believed consistency mattered. Jonathan met her at the courthouse entrance. "Ready?" Nicole smiled. "Yes." Courtroom 7B filled quickly. Judge Eleanor Watkins entered promptly. After reviewing several procedural matters, she invited both attorneys to present their closing arguments regarding the evidence. Jonathan stood first. He spoke quietly, never raising his voice, never dramatizing the facts. He summarized the timeline. Charles consulted a divorce attorney months before Nicole delivered their son. Financial transfers occurred during the same period. Initial disclosures omitted significant compensation and several brokerage accounts. Supplemental filings later corrected those omissions. Authenticated business records established chronology. Hospital records confirmed the timing of the separation papers. Jonathan concluded with a single sentence. "This case is not about punishing poor decisions. It is about ensuring accurate disclosure and equitable application of the law." He returned to his seat. Daniel Foster rose next. His argument reflected the professionalism Nicole had come to respect. He acknowledged the incomplete original disclosures. He emphasized that supplemental corrections had been made. He argued that planning for separation before filing was not unlawful. He reminded the court that difficult marriages often deteriorated gradually rather than suddenly. Jonathan did not object. Neither argument relied upon exaggeration. Judge Watkins listened carefully. After a brief recess, she returned with her findings. The courtroom stood, then sat again. "The evidence demonstrates," she began, "that Mr. Bennett made the decision to pursue separation before the birth of the party's child." Charles lowered his eyes. "The evidence further establishes that several financial disclosures required supplementation after formal discovery." She looked toward both attorneys. "This court appreciates that those corrections were ultimately made." She continued reviewing statutory factors governing equitable distribution. Financial transparency, credibility, conduct during litigation, documentary reliability. Every conclusion referred directly to evidence, not emotion. Finally, Judge Watkins announced her rulings regarding marital property, temporary financial obligations, attorney fee allocations, and continuing responsibilities toward the child. Charles remained responsible for significant financial obligations arising from his incomplete initial disclosures and the additional legal proceedings those omissions had required. The court also approved Nicole's proposed parenting schedule. Both parents retained legal rights regarding their son. Judge Watkins closed the file. "The purpose of this court is not to reward one party or disgrace another. It is to apply the law fairly." She looked toward Nicole, then Charles. "I encourage both of you to remember that today's judgment ends litigation. It should not end your child's opportunity to have two responsible parents." Court adjourned. Outside the courtroom, reporters once again overlooked the case entirely. No microphones waited. No television cameras followed. Nicole preferred it that way. Charles approached her slowly near the courthouse steps. "I wanted to say something." Nicole stopped. He hesitated. "I should have handled everything differently." She listened quietly. "I can't change that now." "No," Nicole answered gently. "You can't." Charles nodded. "I hope someday." He paused. "Yet our son won't have to choose between us." Nicole looked toward the bright afternoon sky before answering. "He never will. As long as we both remember, he's more important than what happened between us." Charles swallowed hard. "Thank you." Nicole gave a small nod. She did not offer forgiveness. She did not refuse it. Some conversations did not require immediate endings. She simply walked down the courthouse steps toward Jonathan and Olivia, who waited nearby with her son. As she lifted the little boy into her arms, he reached up and touched her face with one tiny hand. Nicole smiled. The lawsuit was over. The paperwork was nearly complete. But the future she had worked so patiently to protect was only just beginning. Far behind her, Charles remained standing on the courthouse steps, not watching the judgment, watching the family he had once assumed would always wait for him. Only now did he fully understand what he had truly lost. Spring settled fully over Boston by the time the legal proceedings had faded into the background of Nicole Thomas's daily life. The cherry trees lining the streets outside Whitmore Capital's headquarters had begun to bloom, softening the city's financial district with unexpected color. Employees lingered a little longer outside cafes before work. Construction crews returned to projects delayed by winter. The rhythm of business continued, but the atmosphere felt lighter. Inside the executive offices, Nicole had developed a routine that rarely changed. She arrived shortly after 8 each morning. Before opening a single financial report, she spent 15 minutes reading letters sent by employees. Some wrote to suggest improvements. Some thanked the company for educational scholarships. Others simply shared stories about how Whitmore Capital's healthcare benefits had helped their families through difficult illnesses. Richard Whitmore had personally read those letters for decades. Thomas Reynolds quietly continued the tradition by placing them on Nicole's desk every Monday morning. "You don't have to read every one," Thomas reminded her during one meeting. Nicole smiled as she folded another handwritten letter. "I know. But someone took the time to write. I can take the time to read." Thomas nodded. That's exactly what Richard used to say. Several months earlier, hearing that comparison would have embarrassed Nicole. Now she simply accepted it with quiet gratitude. She was no longer trying to become Richard Whitmore. She was trying to honor the values that had guided him. Later that week, Evelyn Grant entered Nicole's office, carrying a proposal unlike the financial reports that usually filled their meetings. "I think you'd like to see this." Nicole accepted the folder. The title immediately caught her attention. Maternal Health Initiative Proposal. She looked up. "What's this?" Evelyn sat across from her. "Last quarter, we completed a review of charitable priorities. You mentioned wanting projects with measurable long-term impact." Nicole nodded. "I remember." Evelyn opened the first page. "Our foundation recommends expanding postpartum care in community hospitals." Nicole slowly turned the pages. The proposal included funding for additional maternity nurses, mental health counseling, lactation support, emergency recovery programs, financial assistance for families experiencing complicated deliveries. Every page reminded Nicole of her own days inside the hospital. The exhaustion, the uncertainty, the nurses who quietly encouraged her when she felt alone. Angela Morris, Dr. Melissa Harper, faces she would never forget. Nicole closed the proposal. "How many hospitals?" "We've identified 12. Nicole thought for a moment. "I'd like to begin with one." Evelyn waited. "The hospital where my son was born." Evelyn smiled gently. "I hoped you'd say that." Nicole looked toward the window. "I don't want my name on the building." "No ceremony? No press conference? Can we make the donation anonymously?" Evelyn nodded immediately. "Of course." "And after the program proves successful," Nicole answered quietly, "then we expand." Preparations began almost immediately. Whitmore Capital's charitable foundation coordinated with hospital administrators without revealing the donor's identity. Construction plans were drafted. New equipment lists were approved. Additional nursing positions were funded. Training programs expanded. Within weeks, the maternity wing, where Nicole had once recovered after childbirth, began changing. New recovery rooms, updated monitoring equipment, additional family support spaces. Most employees assumed the improvements resulted from a routine philanthropic grant. No one asked many questions. Until one afternoon, Nurse Angela Morris walked through the newly renovated Family Resource Center with Dr. Melissa Harper. Everything looked different. Comfortable chairs, private counseling rooms, a larger neonatal education area. Angela smiled. "I wish we'd had this 6 months ago." Dr. Harper nodded. "So do I." The hospital administrator approached carrying a folder. "I finally received confirmation about our donor." Angela looked up. "Someone local?" The administrator smiled. "You remember Nicole Thomas?" Angela's eyes widened. "The young mother?" "Whose husband served separation papers in her hospital room." "The same Nicole." Angela remained speechless. Dr. Harper slowly accepted the letter from the administrator. Inside was a short, handwritten note. No photographs, no signatures for publicity, only a simple message. "To every nurse, physician, therapist, and staff member who cared for me and my son. You showed kindness during one of the hardest weeks of my life. I hope these improvements allow you to offer that same kindness to thousands of other families. With gratitude, Nicole Thomas." Angela quietly folded the letter. She didn't even mention everything that happened. Dr. Harper smiled softly. "She doesn't need to." Back at Whitmore Capital, another important meeting was taking place. The investment committee had reconvened to review Bennett's strategic consulting. The family court proceedings had concluded. The legal uncertainties referenced during the previous review no longer existed. Thomas Reynolds opened the meeting. "Our responsibility today is straightforward. We evaluate the business. Nothing else." Nicole nodded. "I'll continue to abstain from voting." One director looked surprised. "The litigation is over." Nicole answered calmly. "The appearance of fairness matters as much as fairness itself." No one argued. The committee spent nearly 2 hours reviewing updated financial reports, independent audits, market conditions, risk assessments. At the conclusion, the committee voted. The proposal would not receive funding. Not because of Nicole, not because of the divorce, because market conditions had changed significantly during the months of delay, and analysts no longer believed the projected expansion met Whitmore Capital's investment standards. Thomas Reynolds signed the final decision. Nicole never entered the discussion. Later that afternoon, Charles Bennett received the formal letter. He read every page carefully. No reference to his marriage, no mention of Nicole. Only objective financial analysis, projected return, capital allocation priorities, risk evaluation, professional, respectful. He slowly leaned back in his chair. For several minutes, he simply looked out the office window. Rebecca Lawson entered quietly. "The decision?" Charles handed her the letter. She skimmed the first page. "They declined." "Yes." She hesitated. "Do you think—" Charles gently interrupted. "No." Rebecca looked confused. "No what?" "No, this wasn't personal." He tapped the report. "They explained every reason. They treated us like every other applicant." Rebecca nodded. "I suppose that's all anyone can ask." Charles looked at the framed certificate hanging on his office wall. Months earlier, he would have blamed Nicole immediately. Now he understood something he hadn't understood before. power used fairly often looked disappointingly ordinary. It followed policies, procedures, standards, not emotions. That realization stayed with him long after Rebecca left. Meanwhile, Nicole spent Saturday afternoon somewhere very different from boardrooms and legal offices. She returned to the hospital. Not for a ceremony, not for recognition. She carried her son through the renovated maternity unit, wearing jeans, a light sweater, and comfortable walking shoes. Only Dr. Harper and Angela knew she was coming. Angela greeted her with a warm embrace. "You've made this place beautiful." Nicole looked around. "No." She smiled. "The people already made it beautiful. I only helped improve the rooms." Dr. Harper laughed softly. "You still don't like taking credit." Nicole adjusted her son in her arms. "He won't remember where he was born. But thousands of babies will begin their lives here. That's enough." They walked quietly through the new family center. Young parents filled the waiting area. Newborns slept peacefully. Nurses moved efficiently between rooms. No one recognized Nicole. She preferred it that way. As she prepared to leave, Angela asked one final question. "After everything you've been through." She paused. "How did you choose kindness instead of anger?" Nicole looked down at her son before answering. "My grandfather left me wealth." She smiled gently. "But the nurses here reminded me what compassion looks like. We usually become whatever we choose to practice." Angela watched her walk toward the elevator. The answer stayed with her long after the doors closed. Across the city, Charles drove home after another ordinary day at work. His phone displayed a news article about Whitmore Capital's new maternal health care initiative. The donor remained anonymous. Most readers would never know who made it possible. Charles smiled sadly. He didn't need the article to tell him. He already knew. And for the first time since signing those separation papers, he realized that Nicole had never measured success by what she had gained, only by what she could quietly give away. That understanding carried far more weight than any courtroom judgment ever had. By early summer, the legal files had been archived. The hearings were over. The court orders had taken effect. Monthly parenting schedules had settled into a predictable rhythm, and the names that once appeared daily in legal correspondence now appeared only on calendars coordinating their sons' visits. Time had done what no courtroom could accomplish. It had replaced constant conflict with quiet distance. Nicole Thomas welcomed the change. She no longer measured her weeks by legal deadlines. Instead, she measured them by first words, first steps, and first smiles. Her son had begun crawling with determined enthusiasm, transforming every room into an unexpected adventure. He laughed whenever Olivia Brooks chased him across the living room rug, and he reached instinctively for Nicole whenever she entered the apartment after work. Those ordinary moments meant more than every financial statement she reviewed. One Friday afternoon, Thomas Reynolds entered Nicole's office carrying a thin folder instead of the towering binders that had once become routine. "I thought you'd like to see this." Nicole accepted it. Inside was Whitmore Capital's annual Community Impact Report. She flipped through the pages. Scholarship recipients had increased by 23%. The maternal health care initiative had expanded beyond the original hospital into 4 additional medical centers. Employee volunteer participation had reached the highest level in company history. Thomas watched her quietly. "You've changed the company." Nicole looked up. "I don't think I have." "You have." Thomas smiled. "You simply changed it without trying to." Nicole closed the report. "I only kept asking the same question." "What question?" "Who benefits from this decision?" Thomas laughed softly. Richard asked that question almost every day. She smiled. Then perhaps I learned something from him after all. Across the country, Charles Bennett faced a different kind of transition. The family court proceedings had ended months earlier, but their consequences continued shaping his life. His consulting firm remained operational. Several important clients stayed. Others quietly moved their business elsewhere. The company's growth slowed. Not because of public scandal, there had been none. Not because anyone had humiliated him publicly. No one had. Instead, expansion simply became more difficult after months of delayed financing and cautious investor confidence. Charles accepted the reality with surprising calm. He had spent many evenings replaying the previous year in his mind. The hospital room, the separation papers, the board meeting, the courtroom. He gradually stopped asking himself how Nicole had become so successful. Instead, he began asking a different question. Why had he failed to recognize the character she possessed long before any inheritance? The answer was uncomfortable, because he had been looking at achievement instead of integrity. One Saturday morning, Charles arrived to pick up his son for a scheduled visit. Nicole opened the apartment door before he knocked. Their son immediately reached toward his father with excited laughter. Charles smiled as he lifted the little boy into his arms. Looks like someone has grown again. He has. Nicole handed over a small backpack. Extra clothes are inside. Bottles are already prepared, and his favorite stuffed elephant is in the front pocket. Charles nodded. Thank you. For a moment, neither moved. Finally, Charles spoke. I've been meaning to tell you something. Nicole waited. I read about the maternal health care program. She didn't answer immediately. I know it was you. Nicole smiled politely. It wasn't about me. I know. Charles looked down at their son. I just wanted to say... He paused, searching for words that did not come easily. I'm glad our son will grow up seeing that kind of example. Nicole looked at him quietly. I hope he learns good things from both of us. Charles nodded. So do I. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no sudden friendship. Only two parents gradually learning how to place their child ahead of their past. Sometimes that was enough. Several weeks later, Whitmore Capital hosted its annual leadership conference. Executives from across the country gathered to review long-term strategy. Unlike previous years, the event concluded with a question-and-answer session for younger employees. One analyst raised her hand. Miss Thomas, Nicole smiled. Nicole is fine. The young woman nodded. Nicole, you inherited an extraordinary responsibility. What was the first thing you thought after learning about it? The ballroom became quiet. Nicole considered the question carefully. My first thought wasn't about money. She paused. It was about whether I was worthy of the trust someone had placed in me. The audience listened attentively. She continued. Every important decision since then has started with the same question. Am I protecting people? Or simply protecting assets? She smiled gently. The answer usually tells me what to do. The room remained silent for several seconds before warm applause filled the hall. Not loud, not theatrical, simply genuine. Thomas Reynolds watched from the back of the room. Richard Whitmore had often insisted that true leadership could be recognized by the questions leaders asked themselves. Nicole had just proven him right. Late that evening, after returning home, Nicole stood on the apartment balcony, holding her son, as the sun disappeared beyond the city skyline. The apartment was no longer temporary. Although she owned homes worth more money than she had once imagined existed, She had deliberately remained there while deciding what kind of life she truly wanted. She had eventually purchased a comfortable family home. Not the largest, not the most expensive. Simply the one that felt like home. Olivia stepped onto the balcony carrying 2 cups of tea. "You've had quite a year." Nicole laughed softly. "I suppose I have." Olivia handed her a cup. "Do you ever think about how different everything could have been?" Nicole looked toward the fading sunset. "Sometimes." "Do you regret anything?" Nicole thought for a long moment. "I regret that my son will never know what it feels like to see his parents happily married." Olivia nodded. "And everything else?" Nicole gently kissed the top of her son's head. "I don't regret choosing dignity." The evening breeze moved quietly through the trees below. Cars passed in the distance. Somewhere nearby, children laughed while playing in a neighborhood park. Life continued, not because every wound had disappeared, but because healing had finally become stronger than pain. The narrator had known from the very beginning that Nicole would inherit billions. Yet that fortune had never been the true turning point. The inheritance revealed opportunity. Character determined what happened afterward. Charles believed wealth created power. Nicole proved that power meant very little without restraint. The court never rewarded revenge. It rewarded evidence. The boardroom never honored emotion. It honored responsibility. And the child sleeping peacefully in Nicole's arms would one day inherit something far more valuable than money. He would inherit the example of a mother who answered humiliation with patience, uncertainty with preparation, and unexpected power with quiet grace. Nicole never returned to the hospital room where her marriage had ended. She never revisited the courtroom where the evidence had spoken. She never stood outside the boardroom remembering the day Charles first understood who she had become. She did not need to. Some chapters deserve to remain closed. Others deserve to become the foundation for everything that follows. She simply walked forward, with dignity, with responsibility, and with peace. In every life there are moments when we cannot choose what happens to us, but we can choose how we respond. Nicole's story was never about becoming wealthy overnight. It was about remaining faithful to her values before wealth arrived during the greatest challenges she faced, and long after the court proceedings had ended. Quiet strength rarely attracts attention in the moment, yet over time it leaves the deepest mark. Patience allowed the truth to emerge. Careful records gave facts a voice. Compassion ensured that success became something shared rather than displayed. That is why the ending of this story was never found in a courtroom judgment or a business meeting, but in the peaceful life Nicole built for her child. If this journey stayed with you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Share where you're watching from and what part of Nicole's story resonated with you most. If you enjoy stories about quiet courage, integrity, and justice, finding its rightful path through patience rather than revenge, consider liking this video and subscribing so you won't miss the next story. Thank you for spending your time with us, and until next time, take care of yourself and those who matter most.